The village in it with a map and a plan. No place too tiny for this determined man. Crossing the counties one by one, you'll see in every English corner a bit of history.
Hello folks, welcome to East Cambridgeshire for the very first time on TVI. All this week we'll be covering 5 villages that are just to the north of Newmarket, which is actually in Suffolk, but surrounded on 3 sides of course by Cambridgeshire. Now we're beginning the entire series in a place that's got a very strange name, but hopefully you'll understand why it's got a strange name as we walk around this one. This is the lovely Reach. Reach strip of land. Hello East Cambridgeshire. All week this week we'll be visiting villages in this brand new area, and by doing so it means that all of Cambridgeshire's districts have now officially been started. We've got 35 of them to cover in this one, and today we get the ball rolling with Reach. Reach means strip of land. It's as simple as that. It derives from French, and sometimes you may see it spelt Reche, R-E-C-H-E. Although only a small village deep in the Cambridgeshire countryside out here, this used to be an important economic centre in early Anglo-Saxon and Viking times. Goods were loaded at its common hithe or wharf for transport into the Fen waterway system from at least 1100. Reach was a significant producer of clunch, which would often be transported via the waterways to places across East Anglia and northern France for building. This village is most famous for the almost unmissable earthwork that it sits at the end of. That would be the 11-kilometre long Devil's Dyke, which runs from Reach to Wood Ditton in Suffolk. Believed to be Saxon in origin, it was a defence mechanism which allowed control over trade and movement. The very end of the dyke in Reach has now been levelled, leaving a flat piece of land. Almost every year since 1201, that land has hosted the Reach Fair, which is a big deal in these parts. It's only ever been cancelled 4 times. Let's see what else this one has within our reach. This is what the village of Reach looked like in 1900. It was a small, compact little place surrounded by lots of agricultural land and a fair few waterways. At this time, Reach was not its own parish. Since medieval times, it was a hamlet that sat on the border between Burwell and Swaffham Prior. It wasn't until 1961 that it became a separate civil parish, but why it took so long to break away from its near neighbours is a bit mystifying. You see, Reach, or as it was previously known, Reche, has been inhabited for over 2,000 years. Situated at the termination of the great earthwork known as the Devil's Dyke, and with Reach Lode giving direct access to the sea, it survived the Norman conquest as an inland port. It was the centre of considerable trade in medieval times and could well have grown far, far bigger. Later, as the activity on its hithes decreased and its maritime importance declined, Reach gradually turned into a purely agricultural community. At this time, the village was perhaps just beginning to feel the effects of that decline, but the hamlet continued to thrive. In 1900 it had quite a bit to speak of, and a lot of this is still around today. Take note first of all of the centre, where you can see the words Fair Green. Everything of note in the village has developed around that, because since 1201 that green has been hugely important here. This map shows a church built on the remains of a chapel. That's still there, it's St Etheldreda's. Look how tightly packed the dwellings were. They still are today because there wasn't a lot of room to expand. The reason for that can be seen to the south. This huge area was an enormous clunch pit, and for centuries that commodity has been quarried here before being transported away using the Fen waterway system. Reach was connected to that system via a Roman canal on which there was a wharf. That's gone now, but it was still used here. And one other thing has certainly remained a constant since these times. Running southeast in a dead straight line from Fair Green is a huge earthwork, the Devil's Dyke. Reach sits at the northern end of it, and Fair Green is a flattened, filled-in portion of it. This is what the village looks like now, and it's not too dissimilar, right? One thing you may notice that has changed would be the clunch pits. They've been filled in now with trees and vegetation because it's no longer quarried here. We'll still be able to see the pits though on this walk. Here's our route. We'll start on a cul-de-sac called Ditchfield, which takes its name from the Devil's Dyke. We'll cover that for starters before heading up to Fair Green. The playing field will follow before we make a beeline for the Dyke's End, the local pub. Then it's a case of wandering north through the rest of the village in order to get to the old wharf, where once upon a time ago, clunch would have been loaded onto boats. We'll then go and see where that clunch was quarried. Handily, there are byways that pass through the old pits. They'll bring us back to Ditchfield because they form a neat little loop around the village's southern sections. Before we leave Reach, we'll go to the cricket club using the car. It's a little too far away from the main action here to walk to. Are we ready then, guys? Let's move. Any video of Reach would be incomplete without a mention of the huge earthwork that the village sits at the northern end of. Ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce you to the Devil's Dyke. This runs for 11 kilometres from Reach to Wood Ditton in Suffolk in an almost dead straight line. Alternatively known as the Devil's Ditch, it's a linear earthen barrier thought to be of Anglo-Saxon origin. Averaging 10 metres tall, it's literally the largest landmark around here. It forms a boundary between the marshy fens to the north and the formerly wooded hills to the south. The name Devil's Dyke is post-medieval. In medieval times it was simply called the Ditch, or seeing as French was our main language back then, Le Mickledike. It might also appear in some records as Magnum Fossatum, which is Latin for Great Ditch. The highest point along it is at Gallows Hill, where it measures 10.5 metres from the bottom of the ditch to the top of the earth wall. Since the 19th century, a railway line from Ipswich to Ely and several roads have been cut through it, including the A14 and the A11. So, what is it exactly? Well, there have been numerous attempts to establish that via excavations and investigations, notably in 1923, 1988 and 1991. The efforts in 1923 revealed Roman artefacts under the dyke, indicating a post-Roman construction date. The dyke is similar to Fleam Dyke elsewhere in Cambridgeshire, for which radiocarbon dating was performed in the 1990s. That determined Fleam to have been built between 330 and 510 AD. This seems to be similar enough. Backing up the Saxon theory, it's been described by various different commentators since Anglo-Saxon times. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle may have been referring to the Devil's Dyke in its annal for 905, when Edward the Elder was recorded as fighting and defeating the Danes of East Anglia. So we can assume the Saxons created this, but why? Well, put simply, it's a defence.
Against what? The dark arts?
Well, you're half right actually, Lauren. This was designed to protect against attack, but anyone who tried to invade certainly wasn't using Avada Kedavra. Saxons would have seen it as a barrier for the lands that lay to the east, protecting them from any potential invasions. Its design still allowed for strategic locations for trade and movement along ancient trackways though. Think of it as like a hard border between countries. Reach sits at the end of the dyke, so we'll be sure to see it again in future videos. We have a village to cover here as well though, so let's leave the dyke alone for now. Heading deeper into the place, we next pass the cemetery on the left hand side before we get to the village green. Now, a lot of what you saw of the Devil's Dyke there is behind a hedge, and so it's not really visible from the road. If you walk into the centre of the village, though, you can sort of see it a bit better. There's like a flatter bit just here, and you can actually walk on top of the Devil's Dyke. There's a path there that goes up onto the top of it, and you can follow the ridge, if you like, of the earthwork. We're not going to do that because, you know, the Devil's Dyke goes for 11 kilometres into Suffolk, and that's not what I'm about. I'm here to cover the village of Reach, not the Devil's Dyke just, you know, on its own. So this is where we are. The flat part is the village green, and here in Reach it's called the Fair Green. Let's go and have a look at it. Now, one look at the village green in this place doesn't really tell you much about it. The locals all know this as Fair Green, and it was even labelled as such on the old maps at the top of this video. Why would it have that name? Well, the answer is all to do with one specific day of the year. When the Anglo-Saxons built the Devil's Dyke, the northern end of it split Reach into two pieces. These were known as East Reach and West Reach. Later in the 18th century, part of it was refilled to create Fair Green, and East Reach has since vanished, filled in by arable land. And so now Fair Green is, on an annual basis, the scene of Reach Fair, one of the oldest festivals in England. Originally, it was held annually at Rogation Tide, which replaced the pagan festival of May Day. Now, it's held every May Day bank holiday. Officially run by the Cambridge Corporation, it's been an annual event for over 800 years, since receiving its charter in 1201 from King John. In 2001, on the 800th anniversary of the fair, a plaque commemorating the charter was unveiled on Hill Farm, one of Fair Green's older buildings. Reach Fair was historically a grand regional occasion, hosting feasts and parades. In its early days, the fair lasted for 3 whole days, and its festivities extended all the way down to Reach-Lode. We'll cover what that is in a short while. One of the fair's customs is for the mayor and or other councillors to throw pennies into the crowd for young people. Since 1201, the event has only been cancelled 4 times, twice in the 17th century due to the English Civil War, and twice again due to the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. Close to Fair Green, Reach has another open green space, but this one's more about general recreation and leisure than it is about any sort of annual celebration. These are the playing fields, and they're named after a man called Stephen Folkes. The Folkes family for several years have been really active in Reach as part of its various bowls teams. In the late 90s, Stephen Folkes and his friend Richard Missing lost their lives on the A11 coming home from the annual English Pairs Carpet Bowls tournament played at Hemsby in Norfolk. Next, we have the village's only pub. This is the Dyke's End, and I think by now you should all understand where that title comes from. The Dyke's End is a free house that often gets visitors thanks to being literally at the end of the earthwork. It's popular with walkers, as you can well imagine. When you visit this, you can expect a well-stocked bar with cask ales, a selection of lagers, fine wines, British gin and soft drinks to suit every taste. Outside, the front garden overlooks Fair Green, whilst the rear garden is set amongst a small orchard of fruit trees. The interior has recently been refurbished and comprises a cosy bar and a larger attractive dining area with a log burner and an upstairs dining room. It's family and dog friendly too. In all, you can't go wrong with the Dyke's End, and a few years ago our current monarch thought so too. It's not all that long since the Dyke's End faced potential closure, but thanks to the efforts of the local villagers here, it was saved. As part of that, King Charles III, who was Prince Charles at the time, visited this very pub. You're sure to get a royal welcome here now. So the vehicle noise you heard in the background there was the T4, which is the bus service here in Reach. It'll take you into Newmarket bus station. Not for us though, because I have a car, don't need the bus. Now, opposite the pub, we have another part of the green. And on this part of the green, you can see there is a column just there. That's a war memorial, which we'll talk about next. Back to the green, it's the War Memorial next. Erected in 1920 and bearing the names of the 8 men who were lost in World War I, this is a squat red stone obelisk with a shallow pyramid-shaped top and a double plinth. It stands within a square gravelled area surrounded by a low post and chain fence. A few steps up the road is the village's church. This is St Etheldredus, which is a fairly modern church as churches go, but Reach has had a religious building since at least the late 12th century. The first record of a church here dates from 1378. That early building was founded by Sir John Pexbridge. It was a perpetual chantry chapel dedicated to St Etheldreda the Virgin, the foundress and first abbess of Ely. It probably sat on the site of an earlier consecrated building because there was formerly a guild dedicated to St John here. The chapel was mainly constructed of clunch. There's no surprises there, as you'll soon see. At the dissolution of the chantries, it was considered to be of negligible demolition value, and the fabric was therefore left to decay. By 1768, only ruined portions remained. Following the Reformation, Reach was without a church until the 19th century, and so the locals had to travel to either Swaffham Prior or Burwell. This all changed in 1861, thanks largely to the efforts of the Reverend Thomas Preston, the vicar of Swaffham Prior. After the levelling out of the lower end of the Devil's Dyke to form Fair Green, the present building was erected on the site of the earlier chapel. Its architect was Foster Hayward and its builder was William Bell of Cambridge. It cost £300 to construct. Initially, it was known as Holy Trinity Church and was designed to fulfil the dual function of a day school and a chapel of ease to Swaffham Prior. It continued in this double duty until it was terminated in 1909 by the erection of a separate school building. It was badly damaged by lightning in 1958, which ironically provided an opportunity for a complete restoration of the fabric and the redesign of the internal layout and fittings. A medallion in the upper section of the west window today commemorates the completion of that work. It was at that point that the restored church was rededicated to St Etheldreda and the Holy Trinity by the Lord Bishop of Ely. Interestingly, by the way, the font here, a delightful 18th century marble bowl, comes from the derelict church of St Cyriac and St Julietta at Swaffham Prior. Literally next door to the church is the village hall, which is styled the Reach Village Centre. This is run by a registered charity and provides excellent facilities available for rent. Licensed for music, this can accommodate 90 people standing when full or 75 in a seated setup. Now then, because this is the first village I've done here in East Cambridgeshire, you don't necessarily know out there, people who live in Reach or in the wider East Cambridgeshire area, what I do when I come across one of these things. This is the parish notice board in front of the village hall, and when I see one of these, I leave a card to mark that I've been to it. So let's do that here. Not really anywhere to put it, so just have to wedge it up there. But at least that is Reach complete. Now we're heading through the northern sections of the village, which is mostly residential. These areas are typical of the Cambridgeshire Fens. Tight, narrow streets with houses that front them with no garden. It does feel like a step back in time walking through this labyrinth-like section. So earlier we mentioned Reach-Lode when we were talking about the fair. Reach-Lode is to the north of the village centre, and you might be wondering what it is. Walk up towards it and you may be none the wiser until you actually reach it. See what I did there? Across this bit of Cambridgeshire there are a series of waterways that are connected to either the River Cam or the River Great Ouse. They're man-made, so they're effectively canals. They were created by the Romans, and today we know them as lodes. Reach-Lode is quite deep. In fact, it's one of the deepest. The reason for that is because the surrounding land has sunk as its peaty soil has dried out. Raising of the banks, in addition, has resulted in the water in Reach-Lode being up to 10 feet deep in places. All of the lodes have been navigable historically, but some are no longer. Reach-Lode, whose terminus is here, joins the River Cam at Upware, just over 2 miles away. So why did Cambridgeshire need these things, and what was the main role of the one at Reach? Simply put, the lodes allowed villages like Reach to become inland ports. Reach itself has been a trading port since Roman times. The lodes allowed for wharfs and basins to be developed, like the sort of thing you'd ordinarily associate with the canal network. Soon, a wide variety of products were brought to Reach and to the Reach Fair. They would arrive on vessels called coasters, which only stopped when Denver Sluice was built on the River Great Ouse. Smaller vessels, though, continued to trade in agricultural produce and timber. Reach-Lode also saw boats handle building materials, stone, salts, wines and spirits. One of the main exports from the village was something called clunch, which Reach had in abundance. I'll show you where shortly. Peat was also a common export from here too. A lock was built at the start of Reach-Lode at Upware in 1821, and it was used to restrict the size of boats that could use it. This was necessary because any boats longer than 45 feet couldn't be turned at Reach because it was far too narrow. That did change a little later when a guillotine gate was installed at the downstream end. That allowed boats up to 63 feet long to access the lode, but they could only be turned if they were less than 58 feet long. In any event, no boats now use Reach-Lode at all. Trade on the lodes declined after railways came along in the 1850s. Some carriers continued to operate though. On Reach-Lode, the last boat to carry clunch left this wharf with 525 tons of it in the early 1930s. Peat was carried on for a few years afterwards, but now the lode is completely silent. There's a network of footpaths up there at the lode, and you kind of have to know where to go to get to this point here. It's helpful to have maps on you at all times. It's very tricky sometimes to see areas like that on the map. But yeah, if you can work out where those paths go, you're fine. So now we're back into the village again, and we'll take a right turn here, and we're heading for some more paths. We're going to find the clunch pits now. Right, so now we need to determine what exactly clunch is. Reach-Lode was so successful because clunch was plentiful in these parts. To the south of the village there was a huge clunch pit. It's no longer in use now, but we can see where it was, thanks to a handy network of byways. Clunch is a chalky stone, similar in composition to limestone. It was used as a building material across England and northern France. This was Reach's clunch pit. It dominated the southern areas of the village, so much so that you could fit the entire village inside it and still have room to spare. Clunch is generically a soft limestone, but it distinguishes itself from archetypal forms of that by being softer in character when cut. It resembles chalk in lower density and has minor clay-like components. It's particularly soft when it's quarried, whereas limestone is notoriously hard. The term clunch is a traditional one. It's what the locals around here have used for centuries to mean a hardened chalk. The clunch seam in Reach was pretty thick, but it was at its thickest in Bedfordshire, where it was originally quarried by the Romans. This band was formed when the tropical sea that covered these parts in the Cretaceous period was reduced to a channel about 9 metres deep between Buckinghamshire and the southern fringes of Norfolk. The channel then filled with chalky material from higher ground. In turn, that became compacted and then chemically altered by the cementing of silica to produce its relative hardness. That said, when clunch is quarried out of the ground, it usually still contains a large amount of water. It's only when it dries out that it becomes harder and not as easy to cut. Clunch was so abundant around here that Burwell, the next village over from Reach, has a parish magazine named after it. You can certainly see why Reach was connected by loads to the Fen waterway system now, can't you? It allowed large quantities of this stuff to be shipped to distant markets. As you can see, Reach's once huge clunch pits are no longer producing the chalky white stone now. There are some cliff-like formations that remain from its active quarrying days, but now almost all of the site has been planted with trees, turning this heavily industrial area into a kind of nature reserve. Once through the pits, it's a simple walk now back to the start, continuing on the network of byways that cross the southern sections of the village. Now, given all the things we've so far seen, you'd think that would be it. Well, not quite. There is one thing that's been out of reach on this walk. Okay, we're almost back to the start. This one's taken me a lot longer than I thought it would, because walking through the clunch pits there, the byway is very slippery after all the rain yesterday, and so I was having to pick and choose my way carefully. But we have made it. We're back to the main road. The Devil's Dyke is on the right hand side of your screen right now, and that's Ditchfield you can see on the corner just there. Now, we are supposed to be going to see the cricket club to finish this one off, but because it was raining heavily yesterday, I've opted against it because the track down to the cricket club is very muddy and boggy, and so yeah, I'll talk about it, but you won't actually see it properly. This is Reach Cricket Club on the northeastern outskirts of the village. Cricket has been played here since at least the early 1900s. In fact, there's a brilliant photo that does the rounds online of the Reach ladies team in 1906. I've linked a website below that shows it. In recent times, the men had been using the pitch at Burwell Cricket Club for their home games, but in 2014 they made their return to Reach, playing their first game on this new village cricket pitch, kindly paid for by Amy Kesper. They call this the 24 acres. Reach Cricket Club is a small but growing club these days. After being refounded in 2011, they play in a midweek T20 league and have a friendly game every Sunday from late April to late September. They also go on an annual tour. Okay, so we've made it through Reach and it's time to move on to the next village. Around here there are two villages which sound like they don't belong in Cambridgeshire. They have a name that's more associated with Norfolk. The next episode will see us in one of those. Welcome back to East Cambridgeshire again, people. Now today we're in a much bigger village than what we saw yesterday. Yesterday we were in Reach, and speaking of Reach, it's up there. You can see there's a little bridge there and the road goes on towards Reach. That takes you all the way up to Fair Green. Now this bridge here, used to go over a railway line, but the railway line is no longer there. There also used to be a station here, and if I've got my bearings right, it was somewhere over in that kind of direction over there. That station served the village of Swaffham Prior. Swaffham Prior, Swabian's homestead held by the Prior of Ely. Today on TVI we continue through East Cambridgeshire, and as we do, we visit the first of a pair of twins. These are the Swaffhams, Prior and Bulbeck. First up it's Prior, which gets its name thanks to once being held by the Prior of Ely. The history here is fascinating. Swaffham denoted the territory of the Swabians, a tribe from western Germany that settled in England along with the Angles, Saxons and Jutes after the Romans left the country. Swaffham is a common name in these parts. Norfolk has a large town that bears the same title. Even places like Swavesey, northwest of Cambridge, derives its name from the tribe, as it means island of the Swabians. So without doubt, this is an ancient community, and there was probably once an Anglo-Saxon church here at some point. There are definitely churches here today. Swaffham Prior is unusual in that it has two churches in the same churchyard. Whilst both have been used extensively over time, only one serves the village now. The other has been turned into a communal space. Having two of the same thing also applies to windmills in this village. On Mill Hill to the south of the main road there are two mills. One still crushes grain into flour, and even though the other one doesn't anymore, it still does something. That makes Swaffham Prior the only village in the UK to have two working windmills. Awesome stuff. Let's go and see them. So here we have what Swaffham Prior looked like in 1900. This is a very old village which dates back to the time of the Domesday Book, if not before. It used to be known as Great Swaffham, with the smaller village of Swaffham Bulbeck to the south being Little Swaffham. There are houses in the village dating back several centuries, with the 17th century being the most prominent. Although previously a trading village thanks mainly to the Cambridgeshire loads, which were close by, today it could be described as a dormitory for towns like Newmarket and Cambridge. Notice its shape here. It was a linear village strung out along one long main street. There was only one area that wasn't on that street. As you can see, at right angles was a road that led up to the top of the ridge that the village sits below. The green was up there at one time. North of the village there was a railway station. Named Swaffham Prior, it was on a branch line that ran from Cambridge to Mildenhall. The line has gone now, but you can still see where it was if you know where to go. The station building, though, is still there. West of the village was the extensive parkland of Swaffham Prior House. Dominating the area as it did down there, that's not changed one bit since these times. The village, though, well, that's a different story. Let's see what it had in these days in a bit more detail. Swaffham Prior's main landmarks were all based along that one main street, with the exception of its two windmills on the ridge above it. Here you can see both windmills clearly marked. They still exist to this day, and one of them is still producing flour. Take note of the moated sites Swaffham had. There were 4 of them in a line to the north of the main street. Those indicate the foundations of the village, the early version, if you will, of Swaffham Prior. The version we know now developed along that one long main street. And speaking of that, you can see it was quite a built-up affair, with offshoots from that road being greatly limited. The centre of the village was the bottom of Cage Hill, but all the action was slightly further south, heading down towards Swaffham Prior House. You can see a reading room and a chapel along there. They both still stand, although the chapel is now disused and the reading room has become the village hall. Somewhat surprisingly unmarked is the Red Lion pub, but it definitely did exist at this time. 2 things you can't fail to notice are the 2 churches which share the same churchyard. We haven't seen such a setup since way back in Trimley in Suffolk. Both of those buildings are still there, although only one is used for religious services. Do you know which one? This is what Swaffham Prior looks like today. It's still all about that one main road, but in the 125 years that have passed, it's become far more built up. Housing developments have sprung up on the hillside, bulking out the place somewhat. The roads have changed a bit too. Swaffham Prior now has a bypass. The road that passed the mills used to end at the top of Cage Hill, but now it's been extended southwards to meet the main street near Swaffham Prior House. Road number wise, we call it the B1102 now. The route around this one is going to look a bit like this. We'll begin at one of the new build cul-de-sacs in the north, but in effect the first half of this walk is going to be all about the old main road. We'll only deviate for the village hall, one of the moated sites, and the two churches. After exploring those, we'll complete a circuit of Swaffham Prior using some public rights of way, another new build street called Greenhead Road, and Mill Hill. The latter will ensure we pass both windmills and the water tower that's close by too. To finish, we'll then drive out of the village via Rogers Road in the north, so that we can get a glimpse of the old chapel that stands on it. It's a pretty easy route all in all, but before we do any of that, we have to cover the old railway station. Let's get going at the site of that. Swaffham Prior Railway Station was a stop on the Cambridge to Mildenhall branch of the Great Eastern Railway. It was built for no other purpose than to simply serve the village of Swaffham Prior, something it did from 1884 until its closure in 1962. Upon ceasing to operate, it passed into private ownership and became a dwelling. It's still inhabited today. These are the gates which lead up to it, but at one time, of course, walking up here would have led you to the platforms. The platforms, by the way, are still in situ. Now, as far as the line goes, Swaffham Prior is significant. This village is considered to be the birthplace of the Cambridge to Mildenhall branch. It was created thanks to the persistence of Charles Peter Alex, who lived at the huge Swaffham Prior House. Working together with the GER, he devised the route of the line. It was built as a diversionary branch in order to alleviate flood problems between Cambridge and Brandon via Ely. It was only ever built as far as Mildenhall though, hence its eventual name. This is Fairview Grove. It's a cul-de-sac off Mill Hill at the northern end of the village. Handily, you can walk between Mill Hill and Swaffham's main road via this, using a handy footpath at the end of it. Within a few paces, you're on the long lane upon which this one developed. Although it's known as the High Street further down, this is lower end. It's pretty much all residential here. The number of residences Swaffham Prior has to its name has increased exponentially over recent decades. This is a big village now, often lived in by Cambridge and Newmarket commuters. With the additional population, Swaffham Prior has morphed from what used to be an agricultural village into a dormitory now. These changes have seen the decline of local trade. At one time, Swaffham would have made use of Reach-Lode to export and import goods via water. Now though, it could be described as sleepy. It does have a few features that help to keep it on the map though. Its two churches and two windmills are good examples, and we'll see all four of those buildings around this route. There is also though something you can't see. Swaffham Prior was the first village in the entire United Kingdom to use a rural heating network. The 1.7 megawatt system uses a combination of solar panels, heat pumps, underground storage and electric boilers, delivering heat via a network of heavily insulated pipes under the streets. Homes that connect to it can tap into the heat via existing radiators and hot water appliances without changing equipment. Costing £12 million, the system was made possible by a £3 million government grant, a local government loan, and resident payments spread over 60 years. As well as the heating system, there's something else you can't see in Swaffham Prior. The locals all know that the village sits below a chalk escarpment, but the average visitor to the place might not. Mainly hidden from view, it runs the full length of the village. The more modern sections of the village are built along the top of the escarpment, with the older houses nestling below the cliff face backing onto the high street. In a few places, the ridge of the escarpment is exposed, although that's usually only within private property. However, if you stand in this playground on the high street, you can see parts of the rocky outcrop. Allegedly. Now, I tried to see via Google Street View if that was right or wrong, but I couldn't see anything. Sometimes the only way to find out is to go and look physically. Well, it's not lying. You can see a little bit of the ridge. If I just hop out of the way here, you can see in the gap between this white house on the left and this brownie coloured house on the right, you can see there's some trees there and they are actually stuck into the ridge, so you can actually see a bit of it. It's not, you know, greatly obvious that it's there, but it is there. So yeah, my research was right. Okay, let's continue down the road. We're heading this way. Next, we're off to go and find a pub and the village hall and a few other bits and bobs. Next, we have Swaffham Prior Village Hall. This was originally built as a reading room, with an inscription over the door dating it to 1817. Today, it's a modern community facility run by volunteers, offering various spaces like a large main hall, a smaller hall, and a meeting room. The hall can be considered the centre of this picturesque village now, and being within reach of Cambridge, Newmarket and Ely very easily, it does get a fair bit of use. It's retained many original features, but it's been sensitively modernised too. It's now a light and airy building with excellent facilities. The main hall is a large space with a wooden floor suitable for exercise classes and dancing, as well as parties and courses. The small hall is separated from that by a folding partition, allowing the two areas to be combined for larger events. The meeting room is an area with comfortable seating and tables that can accommodate groups of up to 20. In all, the village hall is large enough for groups of over 100 and is fully wheelchair accessible. Now, there's nothing like a good communal venue, now is there? Now, to the north of the old reading room, you'll see one of the 4 moated sites that sit in a line close to the high street and lower end. All 4 are believed to be Romano-British originally, before they were succeeded by medieval buildings surrounded by moats. All of the moats and larger early houses are on the northern side of the village street. In manorial times, these sites could well have held manor houses. Swaffham was divided into at least 7 manors, a crazy amount for a village of its size. There could even have been more. Although we know for sure there were 7, only 4 manor houses have ever been identified. They are the ones at Baldwins, Swaffham, Shadworth and Knights. Not all of the moated sites are accessible, by the way. The only reason we can see this one is because a right-of-way crosses it. You may recall we didn't see a school on the old maps earlier. There's a reason for that. Swaffham Prior School was originally run entirely by the church, and it was situated at the bottom of the church steps. It was only in the 1920s when the local education authority decided a new school was needed. They offered to build a new school, but should they do so, it would be under their control and not that of the church. There was a great deal of opposition to this idea, and it resulted in the local squire and the vicar putting up the money to build the present school in 1928. The building is still part of the school today. It houses the hall, the offices and the kitchen. As it was nearing completion, Henry Morris began his Cambridgeshire Village Colleges idea, and it was decided that the senior children of Swaffham Prior should transfer to Burwell. There followed a period of great unrest which resulted in the head teacher's resignation in 1934. Gradually things began to settle down, aided in some small way by the onset of World War II in 1939. Evacuees began to arrive and numbers fluctuated between 60 and 100 here. After the war, in 1947, the school finally came under the control of the local education authority, although it retained its Church of England status. Children from Reach started attending the school in 1960 after the closure of their village school. Most of the current school dates from 1966, when it saw a programme of expansion. A mobile classroom was added later as numbers increased further. The library extension was added in 1997, a brand new classroom was added in 1998, and a new staff room was added in 2003. Swaffham Prior is not a small village, so you wouldn't be surprised to find a number of pubs here. Oddly enough, it only has one, the Red Lion. As far as I can tell, this is the only pub the village has ever had. I am willing to be corrected there, but I found no records of any other. This lovely 17th century pub has all the character you'd expect from such an old inn, including golden-hued oak beams, low ceilings, quarry-tiled floors, a cheerful open fireplace, and a log burner. To the rear of the pub is a delightfully large beer garden, best enjoyed on those long summer days. Now, stand outside the pub and it's pretty obvious what's coming next. You might just be able to see behind me there the spire of a church. I say church, there's actually two churches just there. Next we have the churches to go and explore. Churches, plural. There are two churches here because the lands were once divided into more than one lordship. The monastery of Ely had lands in Swaffham, and it was for this reason that the village became known as Swaffham Prior. Between them, the two churches have served the parish since at least the 12th century. One is the Church of St Mary, and the other is the Church of St Cyriac and St Gelita. In 1667, an Act of Parliament combined the churches under a single ecclesiastical parish. St Mary's is the only one of the two which is still used for services. It was first built in Norman times and has on several occasions been allowed to fall into ruin. In fact, it was only fully restored at the start of the 20th century. This has served as the sole parish church since 1903. There's a perpendicular style western porch, sometimes known as a Galilee, but St Mary's glory is in its tower. Built in the early English style, the base and the second octagonal stage date from the church's foundation. The third stage has 16 sides and dates from the 13th century. Such towers were known as lantern towers, and Pevsner remarked that it was a thrill to discover there was a lantern tower in Cambridgeshire that predates the one at Ely Cathedral. The topmost decoration of 48 blind arches is modern, and so too is the rather incongruous needle spire. The south aisle houses the Tothill Chapel, dedicated now as the Lady Chapel. The north aisle houses the Waters Chapel. Both have fine brasses from the Tothill and Waters families. There's also a rather extraordinary set of stained glass in the north aisle that commemorates World War I. The glass depicts tanks, aircraft, submarines and so on, which are very realistically portrayed. The images are interspersed with what the church guide calls apt yet curiously inappropriate biblical texts. They seem to admonish the participants rather than commemorate the fallen, oddly. Sharing the same churchyard, literally just feet away from St Mary's, is St Cyriac and St Gelita. St Gelita, by the way, was St Cyriac's mother. This was built prior to 1200 and may possibly have existed before 1066. Nobody's totally sure of that though. Being on the more favourable, higher ground, St Cyriac's is thought to be the older foundation of the two churches. What we see today, however, is a church that was completely rebuilt in 1810 by Charles Humphrey, with the exception of the west tower that dates from 1493. Ironically, it's this church that's now redundant and the much older St Mary's that has the honour of being the parish church. When St Mary's was in a state of disrepair, St Cyriac's functioned as the sole parish church for 100 years after its rebuilding. It seems, however, to have gradually been regarded with some contempt. One of its vicars, Lawrence Fisher, called it an almost grotesque travesty of a church standing where once there was a beautiful one. The writing was on the wall for St Cyriac's at that point. While St Mary's was restored, St Cyriac's was left to decay again. Having fallen into disuse, in 1878 it was served a demolition order, but that was never carried out. It was thankfully rescued by the church's Conservation Trust in 1973. Now, this church serves as another communal space. It's used as a hall for exhibitions and other functions. In the graveyard at St Cyriac's and St Gillitas, there's a famous grave. It belongs to a Scottish poet called Edwin Muir. Now, there is somewhere in this churchyard a famous grave. I'm just going to have a quick look to see if I can find him, but if not, I'll have to get some pictures from the internet. His name is Edwin Muir, and he was a poet. He came from Scotland. Is this him? No, that's not him. Sometimes when you're trying to find a grave, it's like trying to find a needle in a haystack. I'll have a quick look around, and if I can find him, great. If not, there's some pictures coming your way very shortly. Edwin Muir was born on the Orkney Islands to the north of Scotland, but moved with his family to Glasgow in 1901. As a young man, he worked in many low-paid jobs and soon became involved in left-wing politics, influenced by the work of writers such as Nietzsche. In 1919, he married Willa Anderson. During the 1920s and 30s, the pair travelled extensively in Europe and developed an interest in modernist fiction. Later, they went on to collaborate on translations, most notably that of Franz Kafka. Much of Muir's poetry drew upon his Orkney childhood. It was traditional in form, but beneath the surface there lurked a quiet menace, as exemplified in poems such as The Horses. He was an important figure in the Scottish literary Renaissance. Muir was also influential in encouraging the work of fellow Orcadian poet George Mackay Brown. However, he clashed with Hugh MacDiarmid over the use of Scots, claiming that it restricted the accessibility of the work of Scottish poets. In 1955, he was appointed the Norton Professor of Poetry at Harvard University in the USA, but just a year later he was back in Britain. He died in Cambridge on the 3rd of January 1959, aged 71. That's why he was buried in Swaffham Prior and not on the Orkneys. Swaffham Prior has another religious building within easy reach of those two churches. It's a former Zion Baptist chapel on the High Street. It opened in 1862, and for a short time in 1998 it served as the community's post office as well. Charles Peter Alex of Swaffham Prior House tried to create peace between the religious communities in the village by speaking in this chapel at the unveiling of its war memorial. Alex had also helped to design and pay for the war memorial windows in St Mary's Church too. Not much more is really known about this building, if I'm honest. It became a private house at some point, but I'm not even sure if this is lived in anymore. This should not be confused with the other chapel we'll see at the end of this video on Rogers Road. It's a very unusual one up there. We're about to leave the main street in a moment, but before we do, we have the small matter of Swaffham Prior House to discuss. The vast majority of this is out of our sight because the house is in a huge private parkland. You know what that means? It's time for some pictures. Swaffham Prior House, although pretty big by many people's standards, is classified as a small country residence. If this is small, I'd like to know what big is, by the way. It mostly dates from the mid to late 18th century, but it was founded in the 17th. It began as the manor house of knights, which we mentioned earlier. In 1751, the house was acquired by Dr. John Peter Alex, and it remained in his family until the 1980s. Alex was appointed Vicar of Swaffham Prior in 1752. By 1753, he'd bought the manor of Knights so that his son Charles would be considered a landed gentleman. Charles remodelled the house, and on his death he left the Swaffham Prior estate to his younger son, another man called John Peter Alex. He in turn would pass the house on to his eldest son, John Peter Alex III, who created its small park. It was this John Peter who also led local volunteers during the Napoleonic Wars and became MP for the county in the 1840s. In 1848, the estate passed to his brother. His brother was a retired colonel of the Grenadier Guards who had fought under Wellington in the Peninsular Wars and at Waterloo. His son was Charles Peter Alex, the one we've mentioned a couple of times before. He was a magistrate, an antiquarian, and of course, a railway promoter. There was a gap between the tenures of the Alex family members, albeit a small one. Newspaper reports claimed in 1929 that the house was the home of Alexander Gemmell, the owner of the winning horse in that year's Grand National. The horse was called Gregorlac. After World War II, Charles Peter Alex's son, Charles Israel Lorraine Alex, was living at Swaffham Prior House, marking the family's return. This was ended in 1982 when the house and the park was sold to Sir Michael Marshall, son of the aircraft engineer Sir Arthur. Okay, so next we have to climb the hill up to the more modern parts of Swaffham Prior. To do that, we're going to use a footpath that runs around the back of the churches and onto Cooper's Green. That is considered to be the modern village green, but it hasn't always been. Given what we know about Swaffham Prior's shape, the formation of a village green wouldn't have been easy for it. The elongated shape across the junction of chalk lands and fens doesn't really allow for a central communal space. That said, Cooper's Green provides one now. Historically, the green was located at the end of Cage Hill. It was rectangular and at right angles to the main street. It was still open in 1815, but has since been encroached upon. Today, the main clue that it existed is in the name of this modern street, Greenhead Road. Mind you, there is another clue that sort of gives you an idea. At the head of the former green, there was a lockup at one time used to hold miscreants and petty criminals, hence the name Cage Hill. It's literally a reference to the prison-like structure that used to be on it. At the top of a hill is always a good place to build a water tower. It makes sense. High up on a hill, you get lots of pressure thanks to the gravity involved. This theory works well for Swaffham Prior, being located on a hillside, as it is. This bulky concrete water tower was built in 1939 on Greenhead Hill next to a council estate, and its presence meant the whole village had mains water by the 1950s. By 1973 it had a sewage plant too, sufficient for 1,000 people. That was established off Station Road. Before this came along, one place the locals could get water was a drinking fountain near Swaffham Prior House. It was built in 1874 by Charles Peter Alex, and it was covered with a pointed roof. It served his mansion mainly, but everyone could use it. It was demolished by his son, though, in 1957.
Yes, indeed, a tall hill is a brilliant place for a water tower. It's also a brilliant place for a windmill or two.
Swaffham Prior has two windmills. One of them doesn't mill anything now, but the other one still very much does. On Mill Hill, close to the water tower, you'll find Foster's Mill, a Grade 2 listed structure that stands out like a beacon on the edge of the fens. The mill was built by local millwrights Fysons of Soham in 1857. It stands on the site of an earlier post mill, but it's believed that mills have stood on this site since the time of Doomsday. In 1900 it was said that from the top of Foster's Mill you could see 40 other windmills. That number would have included some of the drainage mills of the fens. This mill, though, has never been about drainage. This was for milling corn. It was once owned by the Foster family, hence the name. They worked the mill until 1946, when it ceased. But it's still working today because it was rescued in 1970 and work began on a restoration process. This culminated in the mill grinding corn again in 1992. Now it works daily, grinding locally grown organic wheat, rye and spelt in the care of the current owner, Jonathan Cook. The mill tower is built of a brick skin with internal clunch lining. The internal finish is lime mortar, with the brick skin being coated in black bitumen tar to help waterproof it. The mill has 4 stories, an OG cap, and 4 double-sided sails that power 2 pairs of French millstones. So what about the other mill then? Well, that one can be found on the other side of Mill Hill. It's known as the Smock Tower Mill. It doesn't appear to have ever had another name. It was built between 1835 and 1850, but it was severely damaged by a lightning strike in 1927. That storm effectively ended its milling career, and the Fosters, who owned both mills at the time, decided not to repair it. It could so easily have been demolished by now, but it was saved and restored by the Bradley family in the 1980s, and that was a decision that changed everything. The mill itself is a notable one. There are only 3 8-sided windmills left in the entire country, and this is one of them. However, something else makes this one stand out. It's what it's turned into. How many windmills do you know that generate electricity? Well, now owned by the Forsyth family, who bought the mill back in 2017, they had the idea to turn this into a turbine, working in much the same way as your average modern wind turbine would. It's a great idea, isn't it? I mean, it literally has the sails already. As well as pretty much writing off any electricity bill that the Forsyths may have, any excess generated by the mill is sold to the national grid. The project means that Swaffham Prior is the only village in the UK with 2 working windmills.
I do love a good windmill. They're not very common things these days though, because a lot of them have stopped working now, and the ones that are working are sort of, generally speaking, heritage mills, aren't they? But yeah, at least at that one over there you can get some flour. Now we have pretty much walked all the way around Swaffham Prior now. Just going to walk back to where we began, and then we'll be driving across to Rogers Road to finish this one off, because we now need to go and see the other chapel. Now, I said earlier this is a very unusual chapel, and you'll see what I mean in a moment. Now, before we leave this one behind, we have one more thing to see. We're on Rogers Road here, a long way from the centre of civilization. Remember earlier we mentioned another chapel? Well, this is that building. The one on the high street was Zion Baptist. This was Zor. Officially known as the Zor Particular Baptist Chapel, it was built in 1821 and is now a private dwelling. I don't think we've ever come across a Zor chapel before, so here's a bit about them. The word Zor isn't as exotic as it sounds. It simply means small. Zor is a common name for independent congregations of both strict and particular Baptists. What's the difference? Well, I'm no religious expert, but I'll give this a go. Particular Baptists believed that Christ's atonement was for a specific number of elect people. Strict Baptists believe in the practice of restricted communion, where the Lord's Supper is only offered to baptised, fully commemorating church members. Both churches believe making decisions about church life without a hierarchical structure. Many strict and particular Baptist churches are affiliated with the Gospel Standard Movement, which follows a high Calvinist theology. So now you know. There aren't many Zor chapels around, and even less that are still active. 3 known ones are in Bradford, Lincoln and Canterbury. Right, that's one Swaffham down, and so now we need to head towards the other one. We don't need to go to Norfolk though. I'm not talking about the town. I'm talking about Swaffham Prior's neighbour, right here in Cambridgeshire. See you there tomorrow. Hello folks, welcome back to East Cambridgeshire once again. Now yesterday in Swaffham Prior we didn't see a load. We met loads in Reach, didn't we, on Monday. Now here in Swaffham Prior's neighbour there is another load, and I'm currently parked, as you can see, on a bridge that goes over said load. Now this is just as important as the one we met in Reach. If anything, it's maybe a little bit more important. We'll learn why as we journey through Swaffham Bulbeck. Swaffham Bulbeck, Swabian's homestead belonging to the de Bulbeck family. Today on TVI we come to the second of the Swaffham twins here in East Cambridgeshire. This is Swaffham Bulbeck, far smaller than its neighbour Swaffham Prior, but still a village that's earned its place on the Cambridgeshire map. This one can be split into two pieces. Swaffham Bulbeck itself is a small, mostly residential village with a school, a church, a village hall and a pub. It once had 6 pubs, not just the one, but the Black Horse suffices for its modern needs. At the centre of it there's a cricket club and a delightful little green. Top-notch, typical English. To the north of all that, there's another part to the village which goes by the name Commercial End. Despite what the name of that may make you think, it's not an industrial estate. Again, it's residential, but at one time, that's where all the trade and commerce took place. Commercial End was an important inland port from medieval times onwards and was connected to the Fen waterway system via Swaffham Bulbeck-Lode. The lode, just like the one at Reach, had been in use since the Romans were around, but now it's only navigable for part of its length. In this one we'll get a look at all of that, and we'll also discover just who Frank Turner was. A lot of you will know that name because you'll be aware of the guitar-playing folk rock musician from Hampshire, but this was a different guy who left his mark on Swaffham Bulbeck. Let's see how. In 1900, Swaffham Bulbeck looked like this. It was a simple enough little village centred on 2 main streets, the High Street and Quarry Lane. It was surrounded by fields and some flat fenland countryside to the north. That defines where we are. At this time, the main Swaffham Bulbeck village was the lesser settlement. All the activity was up Commercial End, just off this map to the north. It was a centre of trade, thanks to being so close to Swaffham Bulbeck-Lode. It would have been very industrial back then though, not residential. So, with Commercial End being industrial, Swaffham Bulbeck had most of the main landmarks. It had, and still has to this day, the church and the school. It once had 6 pubs, can you believe that? Oddly, none of them are shown on this map, but at least 2 were definitely trading here. There were other businesses in the village itself. The post office can be seen near the school for starters. That's since moved further away, but there is still an active one here. There were farms around the village like Downing College and Mitchell Hall, or Lodge as it was later known. To the east there were an array of small clunch pits, which would have provided Swaffham Bulbeck-Lode, the water channel at Commercial End, with a good reason to operate. The village even had a windmill out there too. Comparing the old to the new, this is what we get. Swaffham Bulbeck has developed a bit more now, with newer dwellings springing up in clusters around the main street and on some offshoots. It's a more bulky looking village now, but it's remained relatively small. And so the route around the village will look like this today. We'll go and visit Swaffham Bulbeck-Lode to start with before making our way to Commercial End in the car. It'll be a slow drive through that as we make for the main village. Once there, we'll begin in the south at one of the old pubs and work our way north. We'll pass the church, the school and the village hall before getting to the central green, upon which stands the War Memorial. Opposite that is the cricket club, and that'll follow via the Black Horse pub. Using the lanes to the east of that will form a loop around the rest of the village, taking in the site of a former windmill and some clunch pits before arriving at Frank Turner Court. From there it's easy enough to get back to the start via Quarry Lane. It's a pretty simple one this, so let's walk it.
So, to begin with, we're in the north of the parish, and in front of us here we have Swaffham Bulbeck-Lode. If you were around for the Reach episode this Monday just gone, you'll already know what a lode is. If not, here's a quick recap. Lodes are man-made water channels, almost like canals. They were built by the Romans, and they connected settlements across Cambridgeshire to either the River Cam or the River Great Ouse. Swaffham Bulbeck-Lode joins the River Cam and runs for just over 3 miles, connecting it to the hamlet of Commercial End. Until the 19th century, Commercial End, which is just to the south of where we are here, was called Newnham. It was the centre of trade and commerce in Swaffham Bulbeck, a lot of which was facilitated by the presence of this very waterway, because it imported and exported goods. Commercial End, as we'll see shortly, consists of a row of fine buildings, mainly dating from the late 17th and 18th centuries. The commissioners of the Bedford Level were responsible for this lode during that period, and they cleared the channel and straightened the banks on several occasions. Use of the lode declined rapidly once the railways arrived in the area, much like what happened to the one in Reach. Today, only the first 2 miles, effectively to Slade Farm and back, are currently navigable, as shallow water and low bridges prevent access beyond it. Where it meets the Cam, there's a lock which can accommodate boats that measure anything up to 96 feet by 15. However, since the Environment Agency modified the upstream lock gate in order to improve flood control, the headroom is too low now for boats to enter the lode. So let's go and see Commercial End. Between the lode and that hamlet though, we have to make a stop at something else historically important. At the northern end of the hamlet, there's a track which runs off through a set of gates, seemingly into the distance. This is the site of Swaffham Bulbeck Priory, but the locals know it better simply as the Abbey. This originated as a Benedictine nunnery, and although no one's totally sure of its foundation date, it was probably the second half of the 12th century. As to who founded it, it was either Isabel de Bollebec, the wife of the 3rd Earl of Oxford, or her parents. The Bollebec or Bulbeck name is how Swaffham Bulbeck gets its modern suffix. Bollebec became Bulbeck after morphing into it over time. It makes sense, right? The first mention of a prioress of Swaffham comes in a reference to land held by Isabel in Silverley in 1199. At its foundation, the priory was endowed with the Church of Swaffham Bulbeck and 4 vergates. That's a posh word meaning about 30 acres of surrounding land. In later times, William Hammond built a new farm near the site of the priory, and by 1835 it was recorded that the abbey was occupied by paupers. Census records in the mid to late 19th century show that the abbey continued to be let as tenements. In 1910, the land and all of the property on it was bought by the Alex family, owners of the neighbouring Swaffham Prior House. The building that's there now was restored in the early 21st century by its current owners. So all in all, this part of Swaffham Bulbeck has got a bit of meat to it, hasn't it? You've got the lode, you've got the abbey, and then you have Commercial End, which is what's behind me here. Now we're going to drive through this. We're not going to walk through it, we're going to drive through it. I'll try and do this as slowly as possible so that you can catch most of the bits and bobs here. It's because of this that's why Swaffham Bulbeck-Lode was so important. Now to drive down Commercial End, as slowly as I possibly dared. It's not very big, you see, so I wanted to get in as much as possible. Principal buildings here include a late 17th century merchant's house, which had a counting house added to it in the mid-18th. Otherwise, workers' cottages and warehouses were added to the street by Thomas Bowyer after he acquired the merchant's house in 1805. Several of those warehouses have now been converted into homes. With the lode so close to this, you can just imagine a hive of activity here, can't you? The street still retains its 18th and early 19th century character. there's a former malting house dated 1697 with an attractive shell doorway, and a large former granary, which is now another house dated 1815. Several thatched and pan-tiled cottages date from 1730, and there's even a Victorian fire hydrant still visible along its length. It's a charming part of the old village, whichever way you want to slice it. So let's drive on now into Swaffham Bulbeck and see what that's like.
Right then, we've made it into Swaffham Bulbeck proper. Okay, so we're beginning at the southern end of the village, and there's some beautiful buildings at this end, including the church. Just turn the camera around and I'll show you that. There is the church. We'll talk about that in a moment. But our start point is actually this house. Now, that hasn't always been a house, as you're about to see. Kicking off the walk in Swaffham Bulbeck, we have this building, which is number 108 and 110 High Street. Swaffham Bulbeck is, and has always been, a relatively small village, but that didn't stop it from having 6 pubs at one time. This was one of them, which went on to have a different use. This was the Crown Inn, which closed in 1958. It was built in the 17th century, and as such, for a structure that old, it's no surprise it carries a Grade 2 listing. It started out as a farmhouse before becoming an inn. It gained its extra wing, which is number 108 now, in the 19th century. What do you think this would go on to be? Well, normally old pubs become houses, and that's what this is now. However, between being a pub and a house, this was, believe it or not, a fire station. Don't believe me? Well, all you have to do is look at the nameplate on its wall. Built of locally quarried clunch from Burwell, the church is dedicated to St Mary the Virgin. The west tower was built in the early 13th century and is the most ancient part of a very ancient building. The tower is 12.5 feet square with 3 stories, and it's supported by 8 buttresses. Its nave was constructed in the first half of the 13th century. It consists of 4 uniform bays with 6 octagonal piers supporting the clerestory, which was added in the 15th century. The north aisle was built in around 1300, and the south aisle was added a few years later. Apart from some fragments of 14th and 15th century stained glass in the north aisle, all 10 of the windows in the aisles and 8 in the clerestory are of plain leaded glass. The nave is some 57 feet long by 21 feet wide, whilst the aisles are 11 feet wide. The church can seat 200 people at full capacity. The churchyard contains many interesting gravestones. There are 6 tomb chests, the earliest dating from 1742. In addition, there are 35 headstones with shaped tops dating from 1703 onwards. Modern burials take place at a separate cemetery elsewhere in the village. As for the vicarage, that's next door. In the late 1970s, it was determined that the village no longer required one, and so it was sold to the public. The house itself was built in 1818 for the Reverend G.L. Jennings by Charles Humphrey of Cambridge. It was altered slightly in 1828 by Henry Legg. This next building is directly opposite the church, and I'm sorry, but if there's a better house than this in Swaffham Bulbeck, I didn't find it. This is the gorgeously wonky looking Linton House, which is truly deserving of its Grade 2 listing. Isn't this just a marvellous old property? A house it may be now, but originally it was an open hall. It was built in around 1500 and later extended to the south. In the 18th century, a small kitchen or bakehouse wing at the back was added. I love the exposed timber framing and the thatched roof. Brilliant building this all round. Okay, next we're talking schools. You don't have to go far for them, literally right next to the church.
So yesterday we learned a bit about the school in Swaffham Prior and how there was an immense tussle between the church and the LEA over that one. There appears to have been far less drama in Swaffham Bulbeck, even though the church played a prominent part in village life here. Swaffham Bulbeck School was founded in 1721. In 1728, a school building and a schoolhouse were constructed thanks to bequests from Mrs. Frances Towers and the Reverend Richard Hill. They're no longer used by the school because they've become the village hall. The modern school now sits around the edges of the old one. Greatly enlarged when compared to its older predecessor, the school is also a venue for indoor sports and social activities for the entire village. When children graduate from here, they normally go on to Bottisham Village College. We have a residential area to see next. Although a number of people commute to work in Cambridge and Newmarket from here, this is by no means a slumbering dormitory village. It's a vibrant community with a wide range of interests and skills. A lot of notable people have lived here in the past. It's a list that includes G.G. Crompton, an American-British art conservator who for 30 years was the Botanical Society of Britain and Ireland recorder for Cambridgeshire. Also familiar with Swaffham Bulbeck was Sir Brian Harold Cabot Matthews, a professor of physiology at King's College, Cambridge between 1952 and 1973. He lived in the Grade 2 listed Priest's House at 99 High Street. Another Cambridge professor lived here too, Barry Rickards. He was Professor of Paleontology and Biostratigraphy and a recipient of the Liddell Medal. He was also a world-renowned angler. Frederick Sanger, twice awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, lived here as well. Only one of the 6 former pubs in Swaffham Bulbeck is still in business. A wander up to the green brings you face to face with the Black Horse, which is still going. The rest, with the exception of the Crown, which became a fire station, were turned into houses. This one was established in 1765, initially with a different name, the Horse and Groom. It was renamed in the 1870s and then moved to its current premises in 1889. The pub has a single bar with a dining area to the left, a drinking area to the right, and a conservatory beyond that. This is also something of a hotel as well. It can offer you accommodation in 7 rooms in a motel-like block beside the beer garden, beyond the rear car park. Food is good here too, by the way. It's home-cooked and prepared on the premises.
Yeah, 6 pubs does seem quite a lot for a place of Swaffham Bulbeck's size, but I suppose when you consider you had Commercial End, which was all businesses, I suppose 6 pubs was about right, actually.
On the old maps earlier, we saw the site of the old post office. It was located further down the road back towards the school. Here we have where the current post office is. It's located within this local shop on the corner of Pound Way. The shop is now a Nisa, and it looks pretty big, doesn't it? Well, it's not that long ago that it only occupied part of this building, around half of what it does now. The rest was taken up by an Indian takeaway called Chili Hut. The building was smaller too. It's since gained an upper floor. Increased mobility by car, motorbike and bus means that the reliance on a variety of local shops and crafts has diminished throughout the 20th century. In 1930 there were 6 shops here. One for each pub, I suppose. This one is the only one now that serves both Swaffham villages. Crazy, isn't it? Joined to the shop is another lovely building. This is Bollebeck Cottage, which is great and all, but I still prefer Linton. This gets its name from the Bollebeck family, which we mentioned earlier. It dates from 1587, the year given on one of its door lintels. The Bollebeck family came from Rouen in Normandy. They established a manor house here soon after the Norman conquest, before founding that small convent of nuns at Commercial End. The remains of their manor house chapel are encased within another house, Lordship Cottage, not far from this. On the subject of manor houses, by the way, there's another of note to the south of the village. It's called Burr Hall, and it's only a short walk away from the old fire station. It was probably established by the Inglesthorpe family at some point in the late 14th century. The green here in Swaffham Bulbeck is split into 2 bits. There's a huge bit that has the village sign and the local sports facilities. More on those in a moment. On the other part of the green, which is a small triangle between two roads, there's the War Memorial. Commemorating those who were lost in both World Wars today, this memorial was originally constructed by Messrs Goddard of Bury St Edmunds and H&F Stevens of Swaffham Bulbeck. It was placed here in 1921 before being dedicated by the Bishop of Ely. It takes the form of a Celtic cross and displays 15 names from World War I and 3 from World War II. It's a Grade 2 listed structure which was last cleaned and repaired in 2010. Now, let's head towards what used to be Downing College Farm, away to the west.
Now, one thing I've definitely learned as I've travelled around the south of England, which Cambridgeshire, as far as I'm concerned, is the south, is that southerners tend to like a bit of drama, theatrical performances. It's not very prominent in the north, or at least not as prominent. Here in Swaffham Bulbeck, there was a theatre company. I do believe it's now moved away, but I can show you where they used to be based.
With a decrease in manual labour, two large farms have converted their historic barns into a science park and a centre for small businesses to provide employment locally. One of these is Downing College Farm, where one barn was even turned into a summer theatre. Swaffham Bulbeck established a summer theatre company in 1982. Ever since its foundation, it's produced and performed one of Gilbert and Sullivan's operas. At first, these took place at a venue called the Long Barn, to the south of the village. The Long Barn was redeveloped in 1988, so the company moved their productions to a much more capacious setting, another barn in the middle of the village. When that venue came up for redevelopment, the production moved again, this time to Downing College Farm. 2 years ago, the company was renamed. It's now known as CLOG, which stands for Cambridgeshire Light Opera Group. Upon the rebranding, they closed their barn doors after 40 wonderful years. Now they perform in other local venues, such as the Gardner Memorial Hall in Burwell. Now we're going back to the green, more specifically to the larger part. The big bit is known as the Denny, and it has a very interesting past. On the old maps earlier, this area is marked as the Denny Plantation, and a moated site could be seen close to it. The moat can still be seen. It's within these trees, better known as Denny Wood, on the edge of the green. This is believed to be on part of the land that belonged to Lordship Cottage, and therefore it has a connection to the Bollebeck family. Historic England has protected the site through designation in law. At the time of its scheduling some 50 years ago, the precise boundary of it was unclear. As you can imagine, avoiding destroying this was of great importance when the Denny was redeveloped. The rest of the Denny is a sports field cum village green. This is where Swaffham Bulbeck Cricket Club play, but it's also used for other sports like football and for general recreation and leisure. The pavilion was built in the 1980s by local residents, and it's served the community extremely well ever since. The Denny is a vital village open space and a central outdoor meeting place for the village community. Swaffham Bulbeck Cricket Club are the most important users of it. They have an established cricket square that gets regular use throughout the summer season. In addition, the Denny sees an annual hockey match, and the local school sports day is held on here as well. In all, the Denny, with its backdrop of woodland and its historic moated site, is a central and picturesque feature of the village, a key area for all who live here.
You know, having something like the Denny, it's no wonder that people love this village. On the side of the village shop over there, there's a sign that says "Love Your Village" or something along those lines. And who wouldn't when you've got this fantastic resource right in the centre of it? It's absolutely brilliant. I know it's a drab and dreary, overcast kind of day, but even walking across here on this kind of day, it still looks fabulous. doesn't it?
After crossing the sports ground, we can see the cemetery on the right-hand side. That too is part of the Denny. It was established in 1877. The road starts to bend to the southeast now. It becomes Heath Road, and if we follow it, it'll take us through what used to be a load of open countryside. On the corner here, you also pass Lordship Cottage, where the Bollebeck's Manor House Chapel was located. It's now encased within this dwelling. Originally built in the 13th century, Lordship Cottage became a schoolhouse after being a chapel. Now a house, it was recently on the market for £1.6 million. At one point, it even had a moat. Today it doesn't, but what it does have is a delightful architecture, a beautiful location, and one of the most unusual and exotic country house interiors you will ever see. It's surprising how fast Swaffham Bulbeck has developed. The oldest housing in the village centre grew along a gravel ridge, built there purposely to avoid any danger of river flooding. Northwest of the village were the meadows, which stretched 3 miles to the River Cam. Southeast of the village, which is where we are here, is slightly higher ground. It was all arable fields and heathland grazing pastures up here, which stretched 3.5 miles to the London to Norwich Road, the former A11. As the village prospered, more housing was built along the main street in the Tudor period, and Commercial End grew up at the terminus of the Lode. In turn, that led to a steady growth in population and produced pressure from the more prominent landowners to divide common fields. Some fenland was enclosed in 1640, as was most of the meadowland in 1677. The remaining land followed suit in 1801. New farms were soon built on the fens and on the heath. Much of the latter was used for horse rearing and stud farms that served Newmarket Racecourse.
And you can tell it's a bit different up here as well, because I've just had to climb a hill to get to where I am right now. Swaffham Bulbeck is not quite as on the ridge as Swaffham Prior is, but it's still quite an elevation in this area. And you can see that from here, because if I turn the camera around, you can see we've definitely come uphill. The Denny is over there somewhere behind those trees, and if we go this way we run into these new houses.
Heath Road continues on to meet Quarry Lane at the next corner. At the corner you'll find a batch of new builds. A few years ago this was a car park for a couple of businesses that could be found here. One of them, D. Sangos, is still here behind these new homes. What do you think was here before any of that came along? Well, Quarry Lane is a big clue. There were 2 small clunch pits on this corner. Again, they were nothing compared to the huge pits in Reach, but they still provided Swaffham Bulbeck with a link to the clunch industry. Between the old pits there was a small mound, upon which there was a windmill. That's no longer standing, but you can see where it was if you go back to the old maps at the start of this video. It was clearly marked, as was the hill it stood on. We have one thing left to see. Quarry Lane bends back towards the middle of the village, and on this stretch there's a bowls club. It's called Mitchell Lodge because this area used to be Mitchell Lodge Farm many years ago. Now, the new build street this sits on has an interesting name. It's called Frank Turner Court, and as a fan of the musician, I was instantly interested. He's from Winchester though, and he has no ties to Cambridgeshire. The Frank Turner in question here was a bit of a local celebrity in his own right though. Turner was the man who ran Mitchell Lodge Farm, but he's best remembered for creating the ironwork village sign, which you can find today on the Denny. He did so in 1978, and now, as well as his handiwork, the village has a street that'll forever remember the man.
Well, long-time fans of the musician, we've now solved a problem, haven't we, people? Now we know who the real Frank Turner was.
And that will do us for Swaffham Bulbeck. With it, we've completed our journey through the Swaffham twins. I must apologise if any of you mistook these two for the Swaffham in Norfolk when you saw them, but don't worry, I'll be going there soon. Next, it's another village in Cambridgeshire that had a lode. Welcome back to East Cambridgeshire again, people. Now, we've learnt a lot about the lodes, haven't we, in Cambridgeshire over these past few days. Now, this place is actually named after a lode. Welcome to Lode. Lode Watercourse. Welcome everyone to Lode, a small village to the west of Swaffham Bulbeck in East Cambridgeshire. Now straight away, just by looking at the name of this one, the long-time viewers should know that Lode has a waterway, and indeed it does. It takes its name from the fact that it sits at the foot of Bottisham Lode, Bottisham being a much larger village to the south of this. Lode village used to be part of Bottisham parish, but it broke away in 1894, meaning today this gets its own episode. It's certainly deserving of one. Lode is a standard fen-edge village in many regards, but it's also the location of Anglesey Abbey. That was formerly the home of the Fairhaven family, who lived there for many years. Now the property of the National Trust, Anglesey Abbey is open to the public. The first Baron Fairhaven was responsible for the unique gardens you can find in the grounds of the former 12th century abbey, which are a huge hit with visitors. Also part of the estate is Lode Mill. It's accessible from the village and connected to Bottisham Lode via a mill stream. In the village itself there's plenty to see. There's a chapel, a church, a village hall and a small eatery called The Shed. Throw in a sports ground and a former railway station and you have Lode. To the north there's also a huge polo club. It's a good one this, let's put it on the map. This is what Lode looked like in 1900. With its attendant hamlet of Long Meadow just to the east, Lode was often referred to on maps just before this time as Bottisham Lode. It wasn't until 1894 that the two villages went their separate ways, thanks to a local government act. This map therefore was produced just after the split, and so Lode was just beginning to evolve its own identity. Its origins can be traced back way further than the late 19th century though. In fact, the Romans likely knew this area. The name Lode is a testament to that. The inhabitants of Lode and Long Meadow remained sparse in number until the late 18th century, when the combined hamlets contained a rising population of 800. But hamlets they remained, despite the fact that trade on Bottisham Lode, the waterway above the village, was pretty good. Lode itself was a pretty compact little village in 1900. It's grown a bit since these days, mainly to the south. In effect, in these times, it was all about two streets, the High Street and Mill Road. Everything was clustered around them both. It had a church, a Baptist chapel and a mill, all of which are still standing today. Also still standing is the railway station to the north, although the railway line between Cambridge and Mildenhall is long gone now. Aside from a post office, the rest was housing, and there wasn't a lot of it. It was a neat little village in all. It was complemented by the grounds of Anglesey Abbey to the southwest, but at this time, that was far less impressive than what it was to become, thanks to the Broughton brothers. This is Lode today, and you can see instantly where the changes have come. Anglesey Abbey is now far bigger, having expanded greatly to the east and west. It now extends all the way up to the old mill, which was added to the estate in 1934. The village has grown too. Whilst the two main streets have remained, new ones have come along to the north and the south, greatly increasing the size of the village. Regardless, this one is still small when compared to the likes of Swaffham Prior or Bottisham. Here's how we'll walk it. We'll start at Bottisham-Lode in the north before beginning our walk at the old station. We'll hop across to the mill then, following a stream called Quye Water, which supplies the Lode. The mill grants us access to the grounds of Anglesey Abbey via a footpath, which is quite handy. We'll spend a lot of time in there before we emerge on the B1102 and use Lode Road to get back into the village. That'll take us past the Broughton Memorial Hall and the shed. Then we're into the old village, so there we can take in the church, the chapel, and what remains of the school. The newer sports ground to the east will finish us off, taking us back to Fairhaven Close off Station Road. Now, Lode might not be the biggest village in Cambridgeshire, but it's sure got one of the biggest histories around here. Let's see what we can uncover on this walk today. There can be no better place to start a video of Lode than at the very thing that gives the village its name. This is Bottisham-Lode, which joins the River Cam just below Bottisham Lock, about 2.5 miles away from where we currently are. It's almost dead straight, running between embankments, and once included something called a staunch. That was a type of primitive lock with a single gate. Only the chamber survives from that now. Bottisham-Lode's water supply comes from a stream which passes through the village. It's called Quye Water, which flows through an old watermill before entering the Lode close to what used to be a basin and a wharf. In medieval times, navigation along Quye Water was also possible because there's evidence of moorings at Quye village. The Swaffham and Bottisham Drainage Commissioners were responsible for this Lode from 1767 onwards, and they were empowered to build staunches on it and collect tolls too. The Lode was never wide enough to take fen lighters, but small boats used it for most of the 19th century. In the 1860s, mining of coprolite was extensive in Cambridgeshire. Initially, the industry thrived further to the south, but noticing the profits that farmers were making, the commissioners decided to renovate the Lode so that it could handle it. In 1871, they applied to the South Level Board for permission to scour the channel because it was in a bad state. It was a shrewd decision, because coprolite handlers may have otherwise taken their trade to Fulbourn railway station, resulting in the loss of significant tolls on the waterway. Navigation on this Lode ceased in around 1900, and at present it's not currently navigable. There's a pumping station and a set of mitred flood doors at its entrance, which were replaced in 2001, but since 2008 no unauthorised vessels have been allowed along this waterway. North of the village and to the east of the Lode is Shrubs Marina on the River Cam. Between the two is an expanse of land, which on the map doesn't look greatly special. However, if you dig a bit deeper, you find that land has a sporting purpose. Lode is known for the sport of polo, and it's the ideal place for it actually. Cambridge and Newmarket Polo Club, which you can find further up the lane towards the marina, is the leader of the sport in the east of England. It has 3 boarded and irrigated grounds, extensive livery facilities and an all-weather polo arena. The club has a storied heritage, having been set up in 1990, originally adjacent to the world's foremost equine centre at Newmarket. As good as that was, Lode is better. Located on the edge of the fens, equidistant between Cambridge and Newmarket, the polo pitches here are peat-based. That means they provide the most natural playing surface going, important for the welfare of the animals. Cambridge and Newmarket Polo Club offers fun and competitive polo for all levels throughout the year. It has a dedicated polo academy for younger players or adult beginners. As polo is one of the only team sports in which men and women compete together, the club promotes mixed teams too.
Okay, so we've made the short trip from the end of Bottisham-Lode there to Fairhaven Close, which is our start and end point. It's just basically a residential street, as you can see. Nothing much more than houses in here. But the name Fairhaven is very important to Lode, as we will discover. We're going to be going this way to start with. Let's get things started on our walk. This is where I chose to park. It's a street called Fairhaven Close, which is a reference to the most famous man to live in Lode, Lord Fairhaven. He lived at Anglesey Abbey, and several landmarks around the village bear the Fairhaven name. One that doesn't, though, is where we'll start. Fairhaven Close is a cul-de-sac off Station Road. If you follow that to the north, you'll come to the site of the former railway station that Lode used to have. Now disused, it's located on the outskirts of the village, close to Bottisham-Lode. The station opened in 1884 as one of the intermediate stops on the Cambridge to Mildenhall Railway. This was originally known as Bottisham Station because before 1894, Lode was not its own thing. It was instead part of Bottisham Parish. The name was amended to Bottisham and Lode 3 years after the parishes split, in recognition of the administrative change. As at Swaffham Prior, the building here is still around, but the line has long since been lifted. The station closed for passengers in 1962 and for goods in 1964. Now we're about to head into the estate of Anglesey Abbey, but before we do, we have to cover this building. This is Lode Mill, which stands on the boundary of the estate. The mill was originally built in the 18th century, and like many watermills of its type, its job was to grind corn. In 1900, its purpose changed. Still powered by Kwai Water, the once navigable stream connected to Bottisham-Lode, from then on it was to grind cement instead. The timber frame building has a low breast-shot water wheel, whilst the mill machinery was replaced in 1868 by W. Rawlings. The external cladding dates from its two restorations in 1934 and 1978. Let's learn a bit more about those. In 1934, Lord Fairhaven bought and restored Lode Mill, and so it became part of his estate. In 1978, the mill was restored by the Cambridgeshire Wind and Watermill Society. Now, flour can be bought either in the mill or the shop on the Anglesey Abbey estate. To the south of this mill there's a pond, known locally as the Quarry Pool. It's believed to be the site of a 19th century coprolite mine, so that commodity would have often passed this mill to get to the Lode. Okay, so once you get to the mill, there's a network of footpaths. They're all over this place, and some of them go through the grounds of Anglesey Abbey. I've just got to work out which one is the path I actually need. I'm not totally sure. It might be the one that's over there. As you can see, on the other side of the water here, there's the mill. There's a path and there's some people on it. I think that's the one I need. I'll work it out.
So what about the rest of Anglesey Abbey then? Well, this place has a long and storied past, probably far too much to put into one video actually. I can give you a potted version as we walk through the grounds though. You can do this via a series of public rights of way. Anglesey Abbey is a country house and it's where Lord Fairhaven once lived. The house is built on the remains of a priory, hence the name Anglesey Abbey. It was actually founded as a hospital between 1100 and 1135, but it was later endowed as a priory in 1212. As a religious building, it was populated by Augustinian canons until it was closed in 1536 during the dissolution of the monasteries. 3 years later, it was granted to a lawyer, John Hind. It was largely demolished at that point, and its materials were used to construct Madingley Hall. In 1595, the Folkes family, ancient ancestors of the family that know a bit about bowls in Reach, acquired what remained of it and converted it into a Jacobean-style house. The walls of the chapter house were incorporated into the main part of the domestic dwelling. Subsequent owners included the Cambridge carrier Thomas Hobson. Who was he? Well, you've heard the expression Hobson's choice, right? Meaning you've got only one option? Well, it was from him where that phrase originated, and it was to do with horses. Hobson had an extensive stable with 40 of them, giving the appearance to his customers that upon entry they would have plenty of choice. That wasn't the case because he required them to take the horse in the stall closest to the door to prevent the best horses from always being chosen. The house was also lived in by his son-in-law barrister Thomas Parker and several of his descendants, like the Cambridgeshire MP Samuel Shepherd and his daughter Lady Irvine. Owners of the priory didn't always occupy the house themselves, it was leased out as a farmhouse at times. By the time Parker died in 1643, the property was known as Anglesey Abbey rather than the Priory. In 1848, Reverend John Hailston, the Vicar of Bottisham, purchased Anglesey Abbey and carried out restorations, adding a service wing and a stable block from some remaining medieval masonry. He was also responsible for planting trees including cedars, Wellingtonia, weeping elm and silver lime along the drive to the house. Anglesey Abbey was sold in 1926 to the Broughton brothers, Henry Rogers Broughton and Urban Huddleston Broughton. The latter would become Lord Fairhaven. The house was ideal for them because they had a keen interest in horse racing. It was within easy reach of Newmarket and they're stood at Great Barton. The brothers weren't short of money either. They'd inherited a fortune from their grandfather, the American oil baron Henry Huddleston Rogers. As such, they lived a life of leisure here, devoting themselves to owning and breeding racehorses, collecting art and creating gardens. The brothers made several alterations to the house soon after they bought it, with much of the work carried out by the architect Sidney Parvin. Henry moved out when he married in 1932, leaving Lord Fairhaven as the last private owner of Anglesey Abbey. On his own, he made extensive additions to the house to provide room for his rapidly expanding collection of books, paintings, tapestries, clocks and furniture. The library wing, designed by Parvin, was added in 1937 and was followed by the tapestry hall off the dining room in 1939. The final addition to the house was a two-storey picture gallery designed by Sir Albert Richardson. The grounds, which had been largely meadow and grazing land when the brothers arrived, were also transformed. The grounds run to some 98 acres and they're divided into several avenues, walks, vistas and gardens. Fairhaven was responsible for replanting the rose garden and creating the dahlia garden, the herbaceous garden, the hyacinth garden and the narcissus garden. To commemorate the coronation of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth in 1937, he planted an extensive avenue of London plane and horse chestnut trees, with a crossing at the far end. This was a copycat move, because the same setup exists in Windsor Great Park. Storm damage in 1968 removed most of the plane trees, leaving only the horse chestnut trees behind. Other features of the grounds include the Temple Lawn, created in 1953 to commemorate the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. In front of the house, to the south, there's a formal lawn too. In 1964, American landscape gardener Lanning Roper wrote a book, The Gardens of Anglesey Abbey, in which he described the careful planning of the grounds. He describes how huge areas of sky and mown grass were used to balance symmetrical planting. When Lord Fairhaven died in 1966, Anglesey Abbey was left to the National Trust, together with an endowment of £300,000. Fairhaven had stated in his will that the house should be preserved as a complete and furnished entity so that it retains the character of an English home. Job done. Now, of course, the humble YouTube personalities like myself can't show you all of that. We can't just wander into the Abbey with a camera, but Anglesey Abbey is open to the public. There is an admission charge, but it's free for National Trust members. Across the 2018 and 19 seasons, there were 382,235 visitors to Anglesey Abbey, making it the 11th most visited National Trust property open at charge. A new visitor centre with a restaurant and a shop was opened in 2008. Anglesey Abbey has a range of seasonal attractions, including a Winter Lights Festival, a Snowdrop and Daffodil Tour in the spring, and it even has a summer outdoor cinema. There are plenty of reasons to come and visit it, and while you're here, you might as well explore Lode Village too.
So as it turns out, the footpath I could see from the mill, you can't actually get onto that from the mill. There's no way over the water, and it's behind a big wall, which is why you haven't seen anything on the camera. There is a path though that runs almost the length of Anglesey Abbey and comes out here through the car park and past the visitor centre, which you did see on camera. So here we are, we've made it to Quay Road, Q-U-Y, what a great name for a place, Quay Road. Now, take a left turn here and we'll go back into Lode.
Let's go back into the village now. This is Lode Road, and on it there are two things to talk about, dead opposite each other. About halfway up the street, before it bends to the left to go towards the church, you'll see the Broughton Memorial Hall. Despite what you might initially want to assume, the Broughton Memorial Hall is not named in honour of Lord Fairhaven or his brother. The plaque over the door reads, "This hall was erected in memory of Urban Hanlon Broughton by his sons." So this hall was built by the brothers in memory of their father. It opened in 1930. As to what it is, well, it's a communal venue, but from what I can gather it became Lode School later on. Now it appears to be a house of some sort. Information was scant for this. Over the road we have the shed, and this has far more to tell us. Built in 1931 as a labour club, it became Lode Social Club in the 1970s. In 2016 it reopened as the shed after a substantial refurbishment, combining dining with village pub-like drinking. The large main bar had the ceiling removed, exposing the original roof ironwork, with chandeliers in between them. Fancy stuff. Upstairs was a restaurant with historic local photographs on the walls. Downstairs, it was a comfortable pub-like area with a real fire. The locals still call this the shed, but officially it has a newer title now. After being closed for over a year, it reopened as Pattaya Kitchen at the shed just recently. It's now both a pub and a Thai restaurant run by the same team who run the Wrestlers in Cambridge.
Now, in terms of a school here in Lode, there ain't one anymore, but there used to be. You're looking at it when that van moves out of the way, right there.
Now we're outside the site of Lode's former national school, which opened in the mid-1800s. An exact date is not clear for this. Children of Lode don't go to school in the village anymore. Initially now they attend Bottisham Community Primary School, and then they go on to Bottisham Village College. It's Lode Baptist Chapel next. This is the oldest religious building in the village, and it has a bit of a story to tell. In 2024, this was sold to a private individual for conversion to a house, but religiously its story begins way back in the mid-1600s. As we know, nonconformism was illegal in those times, and so often groups of dissenters would gather under the cover of darkness. One such group used to meet in the woods near Anglesey Abbey. They only had one light source, a lantern. Those people were the forerunners to those that would build Lode Chapel, and the lantern they used in the pitch-black woods to read from their Bible is within this very building. Now how about that for a fascinating piece of history? Eventually, dissenters were given the freedom to practice their once illegal gatherings, and so houses in the local villages were makeshift places of worship from about 1803 onwards. The first Lode Chapel was built in 1810, but it didn't last long. It was soon too small for its needs. So later it was enlarged, but nobody knows when. There is a date stone on this which reads 1832, but that's a misnomer. It was likely put there as a finishing touch to the enlargement, rather than marking the actual date of it. The porch was added in 1872. Congregation numbers have risen and fallen here over the years. In the 1980s, the members transferred to Eden Chapel in Cambridge for a while, but they did eventually reform a church here in 1991. Now no longer religious, today it's that private dwelling.
Well, I guess if Lode does have a centre, this is it. Let me show you around. We've just come to the end of the path which the chapel is on. We'll be talking a bit about this building here in a moment. The church is over there. There used to be a shop on that corner, which used to be a post office as well. You can see the post box outside. And we've got a phone box here. Some multicoloured buildings, some yellow ones. A pink one over there as well. It's beautiful.
Now we come to the War Memorial, which is in the grounds of the Anglican Church. In 1921, a faculty was obtained to set back a part of the church wall to be made available for a cross of Cornish granite. It was built in 1923, and in 1947 an addition was made to commemorate the fallen of World War II. The fact that Lode has a church is a little lucky. In the 19th century, when Reverend Hailston, the vicar of Bottisham, who later lived at Anglesey Abbey, was around, he was convinced that Lode merited its own church, so he saw to it that the present Church of St James was built. Constructed and dedicated in 1853, the Hailston family provided a vicar for it for the following 80 years. Before Lode had its own church, Holy Trinity at Bottisham was where the residents of Lode and Longmeadow were expected to attend worship. Hailston was not the first man to suggest a church for Lode. The Reverend William Pugh, who was vicar of Bottisham from 1811 to 1825, had the same idea. He was a rather eccentric man of unsocial habits, very slovenly and altogether unprepossessing in appearance. He drew up a document setting aside a considerable sum of money for building a church at Lode in the 1820s, but a subsequent will made no mention of it, and his money was invested to be given to the poor instead. Lode remained then without a church. Hailston, by contrast, was rich and extremely active. Above all, he committed himself entirely to the welfare of his parishioners, despite the fact the place did have the Baptist chapel in his time. That wasn't good enough for him. A church was required. A young architect named Rode Hawkins was commissioned to design the church. We'll meet him again several times in the southwest at some point, I'd imagine, because there are various other examples of his work in Exeter, where he designed the Church of St Michael. In Lode, he designed a neat little building built of stone in the Gothic style for a cost of about £1,500. It consists of a chancel, a nave and a porch. A little open turret rising above the western end of the church contained 2 bells at first, but now there's only one. The first recorded church wardens were William King and Benjamin Leader, who resided at Lode Mill. The office of sexton was held by William Ayres, a name that figures largely throughout a great part of this church's history, in fact. On the old maps at the start of this video, the post office was located on the corner near the old school. It later moved, setting up shop here on the corner of Fassarge Close. Opposite this was once High Street stores, owned by Bill and Grace Restall.
Okay, last leg now, off towards the sports field. That means going up this road. Fassarge Close.
Now let's go up Fassarge Close, because this will take us to the sports ground. Fassarge Close is fairly new. It was built in 1986 and used to be a yard that served a former inn called the Cow and Hare. It was also used by Bert Brown as a coal yard. This is the sports ground, known as the Fassarge here in Lode. On one edge of it is the Fassarge Hall, a purpose-built community facility which caters for sporting, social and business events. It was completed in 2009 and it's available for hire to the local and the wider community. On the sporting theme, Lode isn't just all about polo, you know. Cricket and football get played on this regularly. Let's cross this lovely field back towards Fairhaven Close, because we're about to bring this amble to a close. To finish off the walk, we have the cemetery, located along the path between the sports ground and Fairhaven Close. This was opened in 1960 when the churchyard was declared full. Now it's the only burial space the village has, and it's just as beautiful as the rest of it. So as we've learned here, Lode gets its name thanks to being on Bottisham Lode, and it didn't break away from that parish until 1894. Tomorrow we'll see the remaining piece, which has more than just the village. It also has an old airfield to discuss as well. I'll see you there.
Welcome back to East Cambridgeshire again, people. Now, what's one surefire way to know that you're in a Cambridgeshire village? Well, I'll tell you. If it's got a school that's referred to as a village college, the chances are you are in Cambridgeshire. And this place has got a village college. You can see it behind me there. That belongs to the parish of Bottisham.
Bottisham, Boddock's homestead. Okay, to round off this fortnight's worth of village goodness in Cambridgeshire this December, today we come to Bottisham. This is located about 6 miles east of Cambridge and about the same distance away from Newmarket. It's a pretty big village, this one, and it has a history to match. The name Bottisham was first recorded 26 years before the Domesday Book in 1060. It was known then as Boddocksham, and by the time the Domesday Book came along, it had morphed into Bottisham. An interpretation of the name is Boddock's Farm. The village originated as at least 3 hamlets, and more may have sprung up before they all merged together to form its modern shape. Its common fields were enclosed in 1808. The population of the parish at Domesday was 49, fairly large at that time. Now it's well over 1,000. Bottisham is known for its association with the United States thanks to the former airfield in its southern reaches. RAF Bottisham was also used by the British and the Belgians, but it's the Americans that made it what it was. Mind you, they had to. Their aircraft demanded it. Elsewhere in the village there are 2 schools. The larger is one of Henry Morris's famous Cambridgeshire village colleges, the second to be built. Bottisham also contains a church, a hall, several shops, and an interesting memorial to Thomas Christian. Let's see it all, people. This is what Bottisham looked like in 1900. It was typical rural Cambridgeshire at this point in time. Bottisham lay close to the southern reaches of Swaffham Bulbeck, but it was surrounded by loads of open countryside. In terms of a village, it was effectively one street. To the north was Bottisham Park, where the hall, once owned by Sir Roger Jennings, was located. Jennings is still a very well-known name to the locals. It was thanks to that family that this place has its school for a start. The land to the south was again purely agricultural, but that would soon change with the onset of World War II and the arrival of the Americans. Bottisham was by no means a tiny hamlet in these days, but it wasn't the thriving behemoth of a commuter village it's turned into now. So what did it have in these times? Well, anything that was anything was located along one main road, running from the Old Pinfold in the north to the Swan Inn in the south. Between the two, you could find a range of things. One was the Bell Inn, a pub which is still standing and still trading today. The Swan is still standing too, by the way, but it's not a pub anymore. It's found a new purpose involving printers. Not far from the Bell was a reading room, and then a bit further south was the Church of Holy Trinity. You can see there's a school marked there at the church. Schools in Bottisham are very different now. There are 2, and neither of them are that close to the church. Note the moat to the west. There are new houses near that now, but I think the moat has been preserved. Further down still was an independent chapel, and the only thing of note that wasn't on the main street was Bottisham Hall, sat within its own parkland to the north. In all, it was a very linear village, not too dissimilar to what Swaffham Prior once looked like. Bottisham is far from being that sort of village now. Its linear days are over because since 1900 it's seen a raft of house building projects, the largest being the enormous Park Estate to the south. That accounts now for almost half of the residences in the village. The north has gained too, with brand new developments along either side of Tunbridge Lane. Most of the main landmarks here have remained the same despite these changes. In fact, Bottisham has gained a lot more to go with them. So here's the route. We'll begin at the village college in the north and steadily work our way south via the Green, the shops and the Bell Inn. We'll then take a left turn into the Park Estate and form a loop around it via the Bowls Club, Dirt Hills and the church. The rest of the walk will see us head towards the Thomas Christian Memorial before using a footpath to get back to the college via Jennings Close. That's an important name to Bottisham, remember, as we'll discover. Now, this walk won't cover everything, so we need a little drive too. Bottisham has expanded to the south a lot in recent times, so we'll use the car to check out these southern estates. Staying in it, we'll head down the high street to check out two final things in the village, and then make a beeline for the RAF base and its museum. Lots to cover. Let's go. Let's get going with Bottisham Village College. Opened in 1937, this was the second of Henry Morris's colleges, following the first one built at Sawston in 1930. We have met the colleges before, but this is the first time we've done so in East Cambridgeshire. As such, here's a recap. The idea of these was to draw children from the villages around them into an atmosphere where they would develop a taste for rural life and craftsmanship. The buildings at Bottisham were planned so that all the principal rooms ran around a curve, looking out onto the playing field. Bottisham Village College was designed by Irwin, a local architect, and built by Ambrose of Ely. Originally, the school site included both a senior school and a junior school. With the passage of the Education Act of 1944, the school became a secondary modern as part of the tripartite system. During World War II, British and American airmen played a large part in the life of the college. That's because Bottisham had an airfield to the south of the village, which will be our last stop in today's episode. Post-war, Bottisham Village College became something of a showplace instead. It was second only to Impington for all those influential people who were captivated by Henry Morris's ideas. Consequently, this school received many high-profile visitors, including Hugh Dalton and J.B. Priestley. During the 1970s and the 1980s, many new buildings such as the English block, the gymnasium, the technology block and the science block were added onto the original school buildings to accommodate its status as a comprehensive. In 1976, it even gained a swimming pool. In 2009, the school began construction of another new block on the site that would mirror the original semicircular buildings of the school and therefore complete the initial plans that were laid out in 1937. This new building included an SEN unit. Then in 2018, the Morris Wing opened with 12 new classrooms and the Evans Auditorium, just in time for the school's 80th anniversary. The building cost £16.7 million to construct and was named in honour of Henry Morris. The auditorium is named after Kate Evans, a former CEO. Now, Bottisham might be a bit different to how it used to be several centuries ago, but it's always had a focal point, and that point has been this green here, where the two main roads of the village meet each other. We've made our way to the green now. This is one of the oldest parts of Bottisham where the main road from north to south met Tunbridge Lane. This triangle of grass has marked the intersection of those two roads for many a long year, and isn't it a wonderful way to? Businesses developed around this junction, and that's something that's remained a constant to this day. On Tunbridge Lane, there's one such example of a business. This is Bottisham Vehicle Services, your standard garage and MOT place that deals with all your motoring needs. On the high street, though, is where most of the commercial activities take place here. Bottisham has a fine row of shops and foodie-style places, including a co-op, a pharmacy, a fish and chip shop, an Indian takeaway and a Chinese takeaway. They like their grub around here, it seems. Next to the shops, we have the Bell. This is the only pub in Bottisham these days. There used to be more, as we'll discover later, but this has stood the test of time. This was built in the late 16th or early 17th century and was originally a cottage before becoming an inn. As a timber-framed building, it is of course Grade 2 listed. Inside, it's been much opened out, but it still retains more than a modicum of character, being both comfortable and welcoming. The room to the left of the pub behind its fireplace is now a comfortable seating area with sofas. Earlier this year, the current landlord spoke of a ghost named Roger that's been seen on several occasions by the Bell staff. For those who believe in such things, the ghost might well be that of Roger Jennings, a former owner of Bottisham Hall. He was quite well known around here. Next, we have a bit of a wander through a residential area because we're heading for the Bowls Club. It's located a long way from the main street, nestled right in the middle of the housing estate that forms Bottisham's southeastern section.
Okay, so we've made our way to a sports area here, and the sport we're talking about more than any other is bowls. Now, fun fact for you, did you know that Bottisham has a bowls club, but it's only had an outdoor rink since the late 1990s? Very unusual. This is why.
This is Bottisham's Bowls Club. Now, it's hard to date the existence of the sport in this village, but it's known for sure that before World War II there was a rink in the grounds of the Golden Ball Public House on the High Street. In the early 1950s, there was also a bowling club based at the village college too. However, neither of them were outdoor facilities. This, the current rink, didn't come along until 1998. This was mainly due to the lack of land available on which to build one. There was also a bit of an issue over how big such an establishment would have to be. During the 1970s, the Bottisham branch of the Royal British Legion purchased some land close to the cemeteries in this part of the village and built a social club in Downing Close. That building still stands. It's this. There was much talk over the years following of laying out a set of bowling rinks, but the land owned by the British Legion was only enough to allow 4 of them. If a club was to be formed, it would need 6 rinks to participate in most local leagues and competitions. The community had been given some land adjacent to the British Legion premises. The benefactor safeguarded that land with certain conditions, the most important of which was that the parish council controlled its use on behalf of the residents of Bottisham. Now, there's some back and forth here about how the club then came to exist, but it's way too long and complicated to explain here. The end result, though, was that finally a high-class rink was created. It was to be operated by an independent bowling club, but the British Legion would allow access to it. The British Legion Club ceased to exist in 2018, and in its place the Bottisham Community Sports and Social Club was formed. The Royal British Legion still have a branch here, but it's only by invitation of the Sports and Social Club. They no longer own this building. Around the back of the club is an area known to the locals as Dirt Hills. It's not as mucky as it sounds. It's a recreational space, albeit a modest one. For some time, Bottisham Parish Council have been seeking to improve the play facilities available to the children of this village. They do have access to the out-of-hours play facilities at the village college, and there is a small playground on the new Oxmeadow development, but otherwise they don't have any sort of decent-sized playground. Dirt Hills has been mooted as one possible option for one. Next, we have the church dedicated to Holy Trinity. This has some of the finest 14th century work in the county. The tower and the chancel are 13th century, but the nave, the aisles and the porches are all from the 14th. The south aisle has a stone seat for the priest and an ancient coffin lid in its floor. Above the arcades is a clerestory of fluted lancet windows. There's also a font and 3 old screens, 2 of oak and the other of stone, with 3 delicate open arches before the chancel. Inside you can also find an iron-bound chest from 1790 and some fragments of carved Norman stones. Holy Trinity contains a very notable tomb. It has the mark of a vanished monumental brass portrait of Elias de Beckenham, said to be one of only 2 honest judges that were around during the reign of Edward I. The 2 were acquitted when every other judge was charged by the king with bribery. A monument from 1598 shows Margaret Coningsby kneeling behind her second husband, Thomas Pledger. There are other memorials to the Jennings family because their home was Bottisham Hall. Sir Roger Jennings and his wife can be seen sitting on their tomb holding hands. Their son, Soame Jennings, was an MP for 38 years and is remembered here by angels garlanding an urn. The east window is also in memory of another Soame Jennings, a colonel who rode as a captain down the Valley of Death at Balaclava and survived. Bottisham Hall is to the north of the village. It's a small country house that was rebuilt in 1797 for the Reverend George Leonard Jennings. It replaced the family's previous home on the same estate. A Grade 2 listed house, it's set within 56 hectares of parkland. Without question, Sir Roger Jennings was the most notable man to have lived on the Bottisham estate. He lived at a time when the fens to the north of here were being drained. Sir Roger served as conservator, bailiff and surveyor general of the fens. Knighted in recognition of his fenland endeavours, Sir Roger had purchased the old estate of the Allington family at Bottisham, ideally placed because it was on the edge of the fens. At the heart of this property was a 15th century moated manor house. In around 1700, the Jennings family remodelled it, refacing it in red brick and converting the moat into a sort of canal. And so it would remain throughout the long lifetime of Sir Roger's son and heir, the MP, Soame Jennings. For him, life was rarely dull. Leaving Cambridge University without taking his degree, Soame married his first cousin Mary, a young heiress of whom Sir Roger was guardian. They lived here in the summer, but in the winter they chose London as their go-to home. The marriage was ended when Mary eloped with the MP for Nottinghamshire, the notorious philanderer William Levins. But Soame didn't have to look far for a replacement. He married another cousin, Elizabeth Grey. Talk about keeping it in the family, eh? As productive as his long life was, being a diligent MP for Cambridge, Soame Jennings had no direct heir. So Bottisham would pass to his uncle's great-grandson, the Reverend George Leonard Jennings, who proceeded to sell off the contents of Bottisham Hall. It was then demolished in favour of a new house built just yards away. That's the house you'll find within the parkland to the north now. Fashioned from the characteristic white bricks of the chalky Cambridgeshire Galt, Bottisham Hall is an attractive house of 2 tall stories. Over the next 2 decades, Reverend Jennings would greatly expand the parkland around the house, creating the present 140-acre private domain. With Cambridgeshire being open countryside mainly at that time, the gardens and plantations were like an oasis in the desert. I shall never forget, as long as I may live, the happy hours I spent at Bottisham. Those are words once written by one Charles Darwin, who would often visit the hall. Jennings was one of his many known acquaintances. Today you can find in Swaffham Bulbeck's church a pair of windows commemorating Reverend Jennings in the porch. They were placed there by the present owner of Bottisham Hall. Reverend Jennings' father was himself a vicar for over 50 years at Swaffham Prior. Let's talk schools again next, because the church and the associations with the Jennings family both give us the perfect opportunity to. Next door to the church is the original Bottisham School. It was founded in 1730 by Roger Jennings. It was known originally as the Jennings Free School. At one time, there was a relief of a boy with a book in one hand and a cap in the other on the side of this building. It still exists, but it's moved house now. Today it can be found in the church. Unusually for the time, the children who attended this school had uniforms. The boys wore a long green coat with brass buttons and red stockings. The cap had a red tassel and the sleeves were edged in muslin bands. The girls' dresses were of a green material with a white cap and white bonnet. The beneficiaries of the school's charity were known as Charity Boys. The school would move around the village a few times. It was here for a long time, but it would eventually move to a site closer to Bottisham Village College. It's moved again since. It's now on a new build housing estate to the south of the church. Okay, we're virtually at the southernmost point of the walk here. It's felt like a flipping long way to get to this point. It just seemed to go on and on the main street, and finally we've turned left into Beechwood Avenue, and this is where the modern school is. We'll go past that and then we'll go around the rest of this estate as we start to head back north again. Should be another half an hour or so, I think, before we reach the car again. And here we have the current Bottisham Community Primary School, which moved to its current location in the late 1970s. This is a stone's throw away from the church, so it's almost gone back to its roots. The children here do wear uniforms, but they're nowhere near as fancy as those of the 1730s. Now, the school sits on the end of Beechwood Avenue, and to get back to the north again, we need to walk around this for 2/3 of its length. This is a good thing, because this estate is a notable one. It's called the Park Estate, and it accounts for just less than half of the houses in Bottisham. Built in the 1960s, the original concept was to have fairly large detached houses with open green spaces and a strong community. However, halfway through the development, the building firm went bust, and so a new one came along to finish the job. The new company didn't read the blueprints. They added many more houses than were originally planned, including a lot more semi-detached and smaller dwellings. The result was a much more compact estate. Despite the changes, today it's sort of similar to how it was originally envisaged though. It's a large but relatively open estate with many community lawns and grassed areas. The estate itself is led by Beechwood Avenue, a horseshoe-shaped road which encloses the rest of the housing. Several paths allow access between the various cul-de-sacs. Okay, we found our way to a street called Ancient Meadows, which ironically doesn't look very ancient. You can probably tell this is one of the newest streets in Bottisham. These houses have all been built within the last couple of decades, I would have said, or maybe a little bit, maybe been here a little bit longer than that. One thing that's on Ancient Meadows, as well as the housing, is the doctor's surgery. It's just there. After leaving the park estate behind, we've used a footpath that runs to this street, Ancient Meadows. This is where you'll find the local surgery, Bottisham Medical Practice. It serves the village and several others around it, such as Lode, Reach and the Swaffhams. On Tunbridge Lane, almost dead opposite the surgery, there's a street called Thomas Christian Way. As well as the street, the man in question it's named for also has a memorial where it meets the Tunbridge Lane. So, who was he? Well, we'll find out later at the airfield. Oh, and by the way, if you look to the northeast here in the direction of Bottisham Hall, you're looking at the same time towards a deserted medieval village. It was called Angerhale, and only some faint earthworks of former tofts and crofts remain of it today. Angerhale possibly existed by 1100 and was certainly inhabited by the 1260s. Most of it is represented by a line of earthworks visible in the northern part of Bottisham Park, running northeast towards the moat around the old Allington Manor House. Men of Angerhale and houses there were still recorded in the mid-14th century, but the name had become disused and the settlement had disappeared by the 16th century. Not a lot of people even know it existed at all, but that's why I do what I do. And that last street you saw there was Jennings Close, and you all understand the name behind that one now, don't you? The village college is behind me over there, which means we've made it all the way around the walking routes here in Bottisham, but there's still a few things to cover using the car. So now we're going to head down to something called the Ox Meadow development, which has got a moated site within it. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to see the moated site, but I can at least tell you about it. When we've done that, we'll then head
all the way to the end of the main street and check out the Swan and another chapel, and then we're off to the airbase.
Alright, so now we need to drive around the southern estates that were not covered on the walk. In recent times, Bottisham has expanded greatly in its southwestern corner. This was once an expanse of fields, but it's now occupied mainly by the Ox Meadow development. Now at the end of Ox Meadow there's the remains of a moated site which was never disturbed by the modern construction. It's believed to have been associated with Thomas de Bendish, who held an estate in the parish in 1288. A large red brick house with a chapel at one end stood on what's now a rectangular island in the middle of the moat. The house that was there was demolished in the early 19th century, although that was thought to have been a post-medieval building replacement for an earlier manor house. The road out of Bottisham to the south has two more landmarks on it that we need to cover. Here's the first one. This was marked as an independent chapel on the old maps, but everyone knows this as the Methodist Church. It's not hosting religious gatherings now though. Built in 1868, Bottisham Methodist Church is now the base of the local scout group. It can also be hired for private events as well, such as children's parties, dance lessons, meetings, keep fit classes, jumble sales, and even musical practice sessions. It's a versatile building these days. The other thing is the former Swan Inn, a pub that's no longer pulling pints, but is still occupied by a business. That business is First Copy IT. Part of the Zeratech group, and with over 30 years in the industry, these guys supply businesses, schools and charities with multifunctional printers and presses. As a pub, the Swan Inn has been here since the middle of the 19th century at the very least, but little else is really known about it. So as such, we'll hop back in the car and head towards the final thing left to cover. Arguably, it's what Bottisham is mainly known for. The road to the south of the Swan is the A1303, which passes along the northern edge of an airfield. It was used during World War II by both the British and the Americans, and the Belgians had a go briefly too. We know it as RAF Bottisham. RAF Bottisham opened in March 1940 and was first used by Havilland Tiger Moth bombers from the No. 22 Elementary Flying Training School. Their mission here was pretty simple. They were prepared for possible anti-invasion duties during World War II. Bottisham never had one particular resident squadron. The Tiger Moths remained until 1941, and when they left, Bottisham was transferred to No. 241 Squadron Army Cooperation Command, which used Westland Lysanders, Curtiss Tomahawks and North American Mustang Mk1s. From the middle of 1942, the airfield was used by RAF Squadrons No. 168 and 652, as well as a number of others, before being turned over to the United States Army Air Force. Under their control, it was vastly expanded. Large numbers of USAAF fighter groups arrived in 1943, and Bottisham was designated by them as Station 374. The airfield was enlarged, and areas of steel matting were laid. The airfield was first used by the 361st Fighter Group, who came from Richmond, Virginia. The group entered combat with the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt aircraft in 1944, before later switching to North American P-51 Mustangs. The unit served primarily as an escort organisation for B-24 Liberator bomber formations that the USAAF sent against targets on the continent. The group also engaged in several missions. It attacked such targets as aerodromes, marshalling yards and missile sites. It participated in the so-called Big Week against the Germans in February 1944, the Normandy invasion in the June, and the Saint-Lô breakthrough in the July. The weight of the heavy P-47 fighters presented a problem at Bottisham for the Americans. On a wet surface, the weight made takeoffs tricky. To combat that, a 1,470-yard-long runway with pierced steel planking, or PSP, was created. It was considered a record for laying that type of prefabricated surface. The runway later became the main one at Bottisham, but there was another one also constructed in the same way. The Americans eventually left and moved to RAF Little Walden because it had concrete runways and much better facilities. Nonetheless, they transformed Bottisham beyond recognition. From mid-1945 until early 1946, Bottisham was used temporarily by Belgian airmen until it closed. Today, very few traces of RAF Bottisham remain, as the land has all been reclaimed for farming. A mere handful of buildings remain in use. The outline of the PSP runway can still be seen too. There's now a museum at the former airfield which proudly flies the flag of the United States of America. The museum opened in 2009 and it's the only one in the UK dedicated to the RAF, the USAAF and the Belgian Air Force. It operates out of one of the remaining airfield buildings. And to finish, let's tell the story of Thomas Christian, who knew RAF Bottisham quite well. Born Thomas Jonathan Jackson Christian Jr. in 1915, he came from San Francisco, California. Commonly, he was known as Jack, and he had a distinguished military career. He was the great-grandson of Stonewall Jackson, a commander of the Confederate Army in the American Civil War. He was also the son of a brigadier general, so the military ethos ran thick through his veins. It was no surprise then that he chose to follow in his father's footsteps. He began his military career with the Field Artillery, where he was soon appointed as a second lieutenant. Not long after, though, he changed his mind, being drawn to the idea of flying, and so he studied initially at the Texas Air Corps Flying School in Dallas. After progressing further to the Air Corps Advanced Flying School in San Antonio, by 1940 he'd passed. A year later, he'd been posted overseas, more specifically to the Philippines. There, he flew a B-17 Flying Fortress bomber until the outbreak of World War II. Later, he was reassigned to Australia. In 1943, Christian returned to the United States, where he married Marjorie Lou Ashcroft, a woman he had met in Dallas. By that time, he was Major Christian and joined the 361st Fighter Group, becoming their first commanding officer. That group would later come to Bottisham. His first aircraft at Bottisham had a picture of a crawling baby painted on its nose. It was a tribute to his own baby, named Llewellyn, that he hadn't yet seen. Throughout his flying career with the group, Colonel Christian would fly 3 aircraft nicknamed Lou, Lou III and Lou IV. In 1944, he was promoted to colonel, still at the tender age of just 28. He would fly over 70 combat missions before embarking on his final and fatal one on August 12, 1944. On that day, he was flying Lou IV in a ground attack role against marshalling yards at Busselot-en-Mont in France. Over the target area, accurate and heavy ground fire made flying difficult, and it was probably this that brought down his plane, causing it to crash. Colonel Christian was killed in that crash. Just weeks before, he'd taken part in a photo shoot at Bottisham with 3 other P-51 Mustangs. They became affectionately known as the Bottisham 4. The photo has since become a tribute to Christian and all that he achieved. He has several physical memorials around the village. The street and the little plaque on Tunbridge Lane are just 2 of them. At RAF Bottisham is a further tribute to him. It's a Litgate-style memorial, which is missing its top these days, but it was unveiled in 1955 by his daughter Lou, the baby girl on his aircraft, who he never got to see. Marjorie Lou, Thomas's wife, died in 1984, whilst Lou herself died in 2011. Thomas's body was never recovered after the crash, and so he appears in the tablets of the missing at the Ardennes American Cemetery and on the memorial at Neuville-en-Condre-Liège in Belgium. He also has several cenotaph memorials in the Texas State Cemetery in Austin. And folks, that's it. Bottisham is behind us and it's time to move on. That's also it for Cambridgeshire for 2025, but I've no intention of stopping the tradition of coming back to the county annually just before Christmas. So, I'll be back in 2026. See you in 50 weeks, if not before. Now, just before I go, remember, this video is part of a huge project to visit every civil parish in England. That's more than 10,000. These routes are pre-planned, and due to time constraints, I can't cover every detail or walk down every street. Please don't complain if this video missed something out. I pronounce names how I choose to. I am very aware that local dialect may vary, and I don't take kindly to criticism about this. You've been warned. It's impossible to know everything too. If this video was terrible, make your own. If you're a regular watcher of The Village Idiot, you're not the only one. If you've got a small business, why not use my videos to advertise it? Leave a comment below if you're interested. And finally, thanks for watching this episode, everybody. Give us a like and a subscribe if you've enjoyed this episode, and share it with your friends and relatives. It all helps to keep this mission going. Until next time, I've been Andy, also known as The Village Idiot, and I'm out.